I had just had dinner, gotten in my car. I don't remember whether or not I turned on the ignition, but the next thing I saw were these little flames. They were only about 2 or 3 inches high. They were coming out of the defroster vents. I never heard any noise. I just saw the flames reflected against the windshield. And I remember I asked myself, why is my car on fire? And the flames started getting bigger. There must have been a strong enough jolt to throw me against the steering wheel because it hurt my ribs, but I don't remember any of that. All I thought was that my car was having some kind of mechanical problem. And I didn't panic. I knew I had to get out of the car. I had to get away from the flames, call the garage, so I reached for the door handle. I almost torched my arm. There were flames shooting up between the seat and the door. Now I knew I had to get out of the car. I'd never see my kids again. This time I used my right hand to grab the door handle. I threw my shoulder against the door at the same time. It worked. I fell onto the ground. There were flames all around me. Some of my clothes were on fire. I was burning. I rolled around the ground till the flames were out. 2 men helped me to my feet and got me about 20 or 30 feet from the car. They told me to get down, but I didn't want to. I kept saying I was all right. They insisted I get down. And when I did, it was as though the atom bomb had gone off. I saw my car jump about 2 feet into the air, and then flames shot up to the roof about 2 stories high. That's when I realized for the first time it hadn't been an accident. That's when I knew somebody put a bomb in my car.
Before his car was blown up outside Marie Callender's restaurant on East Sahara Avenue on October 4th, 1982, Frank Lefty Rosenthal had been one of the most powerful and controversial men in Las Vegas. He was in charge of the largest casino operation in Nevada. He was famous for being the man who had brought sportsbook betting to Vegas, an achievement that made him a true visionary in the annals of local history. He was a gambler's gambler, a man who set the odds, a perfectionist who had once astonished the kitchen help in the Stardust Hotel by insisting that every blueberry muffin had to have at least 10 blueberries in it. But Frank Rosenthal had been dodging trouble most of his life. He was a runner, clerk, and bookie for Chicago gamblers and mobsters before he was old enough to vote. In fact, before going to work inside the casinos in 1971, Lefty had held only one legitimate job, as a military policeman in Korea between 1956 and 1958. Frank Rosenthal came to Las Vegas in 1968 for the same reason so many other Americans have, to get away from his past. It was also the city where you could strike it rich, a kind of money-happy Lourdes where pilgrims got to hang up their psychic crutches and start life anew. Casinos mean cash. From the nickel slots to the $500 progressive super slots, cash is the blood that enlivens everything and everyone in a casino. The buildings are nothing but a cacophony of money. From the noisy geysers of a winner's silver change tumbling into the purposely hollow metal trays, to the bells and buzzers and lights announcing minute-by-minute wins, cash dominates the room. Normal business techniques of fiduciary responsibility and cash accountability crumble under the mountains of paper money and silver coins that pour into casinos every day. There is probably no type of business in the world where as much paper money is handled on a daily basis by more people under more security than in a casino. Dealers have to clap their hands under the eye before leaving the table to make sure they're not carrying any chips away with them. The small aprons they wear are to cover their pockets and keep them from filling them. Every $100 bill changed for chips at the table must be called out by the dealer so the pit boss can watch it being slid into the narrow drop box slot with a metal paddle. No matter how busy a craps or roulette table might be, the chips must be evenly stacked by color to facilitate the almost continuous counting by supervisors. Blackjack dealers have to learn to cup the deck against side readers to make sure players in cahoots aren't swapping paints or face cards to beat the house. An experienced stickman at a craps table is trained never to take his eyes off the dice. Trying to beat the casino through a miraculous win or alternatively through the more reliable methods of being a crook is what brings everyone to town. In Las Vegas, beating the casino by hook or crook has been raised to an art form. But, of course, the greatest amount of casino theft has nothing to do with cheating players or crooked dealers. Most of the major theft in a casino doesn't even happen on the casino floor. The largest amount of larceny takes place behind closed doors in the casino's sanctum sanctorum, the casino's most sensitive and security-conscious area, the place where all of the cash, churning its way through the hundreds of games and slot machines, ultimately heads the casino's sacred count rooms. Usually, it is a windowless, double-locked, bare-bones workroom with straight-back secretarial chairs, clear plastic tables, and reinforced steel shelves and floors to bear the tons of coins and stacks of cash that must be counted daily. The count room is the place where the hundreds of double-locked metal boxes under every table game are emptied. Then their contents of $10, $20, and $100 bills are sorted into inch-thick $10,000 bricks and on busy days stacked against the walls chest-high. There are no strangers stealing this money in the count room. The money is taken in spite of the fact that cameras are often in use, that guards check everyone walking in and out, that only a very limited number of people can even enter. State law bars even casino owners, and that every dollar counted out of every single drop box on every shift must be signed and initialed by at least 2 or 3 independent clerks and supervisors. Count room workers go about their tasks with the deadened glaze of people who must steel themselves against the dazzling daily experience of being immersed in the sight, smell, and touch of money. Tons of it. Stacks of it. Bundles of cash and boxes of coins so heavy that hydraulic lifts must be used to move the tonnage of loot around the count room. There is such a daily fortune of stacked paper bills pouring into the count room that rather than being counted, the cash is assembled into various denominations and weighed. The dream for many of those who find themselves owning casinos or even working in them is to figure out exactly how to separate the count room from its loot. Over the years, the methods employed have run from owners getting their hands on drop box keys to employees grabbing fists full of cash before the boxes are even counted. There are complicated methods of misdirected fill slips and maladjusted scales that weigh only 1/3 of the loot coming through the count room doors. The systems for skimming casinos are as varied as the genius of the men doing the skimming. In 1974, only 6 years after arriving in Las Vegas, Frank Rosenthal had managed to get from Las Vegas exactly what he'd hoped, a new life. He was running 4 Las Vegas casinos. He had married a gorgeous former showgirl named Jerry McGee, and they lived with their 2 children in a $1 million house facing the 14th tee on the Las Vegas Country Club golf course. He had a swimming pool and a housekeeper. His bedroom closet had over 200 pairs of custom-made silk cotton and linen slacks, most of them in pastel shades, which he had specially fitted by tailors flown in from Beverly Hills and Chicago. He was the man to see at the Stardust, and his reputation as an innovative and successful casino manager was soon to be recognized throughout Nevada. He saw himself as a part of an elite group of casino impresarios, union pension fund officials, investment bankers, and Nevada politicians who were about to transform Las Vegas from its cowboy and gangster roots into the family-oriented $30 billion a year adult theme park it would eventually become. But 10 years later, Frank Rosenthal was under investigation as the mob's casino man in town and the suspected mastermind behind a multi-million-dollar skimming operation. He had been denied a gambling license and was hosting an inadvertently hilarious 90-minute talk show, which he had modestly named The Frank Rosenthal Show. He was suspected of working in cahoots with his boyhood friend Anthony Tony the Ant Spilotro, who the FBI said was the Chicago mob's main muscle in town, a hitman suspected of at least a dozen homicides. At the time of Lefty's explosion, Spilotro was under indictment, along with 8 members of his gang for running an extortion, loan sharking, and burglary ring out of a jewelry shop he owned just off the Strip. He was also the prime suspect in Lefty's attempted murder, and he was a man with a motive. He was having a love affair with Lefty Rosenthal's wife. Well, maybe not a love affair. Very little that happened in Las Vegas had to do with love. but an affair nonetheless, one that had been documented by the FBI agents who were assigned to follow Spalatro, and that had eventually become public knowledge. How it could have come to this in just a few years was a question that would haunt not just Lefty, but the mob bosses who the Fed said had put him in to run the casinos in the first place. Instead of calm, Lefty gave them chaos. Instead of a quiet path into the new Las Vegas, Lefty and Spalatro created so much turmoil and caused such law enforcement scrutiny that rather than retiring with their tidy nest egg of skimmed millions as planned, the septuagenarian mob bosses of Chicago, Kansas City, and Milwaukee were facing the rest of their lives in prison. It should not have ended this way. It should have been so sweet. Everything was in place. It was better than an even money bet. It was a wager you couldn't lose. And yet 8 years later, the whole thing blew up in the parking lot on East Sahara Avenue. Lefty Rosenthal did not believe in luck. He believed in the odds, in the numbers, in probability, in the math, in the fractions of data that he had accumulated copying team statistics onto index cards. He believed that games were fixed and that referees and zebras could be bought. He knew some basketball players who practiced the art of missing basketball rim shots for hours every day. And he knew gamblers who bet the middles between the odds spread and got a return of 10% on their money. He believed that some athletes played lazy and some of them played hurt. He believed in winning and losing streaks. He believed in point spreads and no-limit bets and card mechanics so good they could deal out cards without breaking the cellophane on the deck. In other words, where gambling was concerned, Lefty believed in everything but luck. Luck was the potential enemy. Luck was the temptress, the seductive whisperer taking you away from the data. Lefty learned early that if he was ever to master the skill and become a professional player, he had to take even the remotest possibility of chance out of the process. Frank Lefty Rosenthal was born on June 12, 1929, just a few months before the stock market crash. He was raised on Chicago's West Side, an old-world syndicate neighborhood where bookie shops, crooked cops, corrupt aldermen, and closed mouths were a way of life.
My dad was a produce wholesaler, an administrative type. Good with numbers, smart, successful. My mother was a housewife. I grew up reading the racing form. I used to tear it apart. I knew everything there was to know about the form. I used to read it in class. I was a tall, skinny, shy kid. I was 6'1" when I was a teenager, and I was kind of withdrawn. I was sort of a loner. Horse racing was my challenge. My dad owned some horses, so I was at the track with him all the time. I lived at the track. I got some resistance at home when I started getting into sports betting. My mother knew I was gambling, and she didn't like it. But I was very strong-headed. I wouldn't listen to anyone. I loved going over the charts, the past performances, jockeys, post positions. I used to copy all that material onto my own 8x10-inch file cards in my room late into the night. Back then, you didn't have sports channels and magazines and newspapers and radio shows specialized in betting sports. And if you were in the Midwest, you couldn't easily find out what was happening to the East and West Coast teams behind the scenes. You get the final score, and that was about that. But if you're betting seriously, you gotta know a lot more than that. So I started reading everything. My father got me a shortwave radio, and I remember spending hours listening to the play-by-play of out-of-town teams I was thinking of betting. I'd go to this newsstand where they had all the out-of-town papers. That's where I met Jaime the Ace. He was a legendary professional. I don't call people legends unless they are. Jaime the Ace was a legend. He would be there at the same newsstand buying dozens of papers, just like me. He'd get into his car, start reading. I'd be there too, except I didn't have a car. I had a bike. After a while, we got to know each other. He knew what I was doing. There was a Northwestern Michigan basketball game that was coming up. I had people at both schools feeding me information, and I felt really strong. So I bet Northwestern to beat Michigan State. It was a sellout crowd. I walked in and I saw Jaime the ace. Now, Jaime knows more about basketball than any man alive. We say hello. It's 10 minutes to tip-off. I told him I played Northwestern and asked what he was doing. I was so certain about my information that I had made what I used to call a triple play. I'd bet $2,000. I'm just a kid. It's my limit. We're talking about a time when my whole bankroll was $8,000. What? Jaime says, surprised. Why are you playing Northwestern? Don't you know about Johnny Green? Now, Johnny Green was a black player who had been ineligible for the whole season. It turned out he had suddenly become eligible a couple of days before the game. I'd missed it. Green's going to take every rebound in the game, Ace said, and my heart sank. I ran to the phones, but there were just 2 booths, and there were 25 people waiting at each booth. I'm looking to lay off some of my bets, get rid of them, balance some of the action. I'm still standing in line waiting for the phone when I hear the announcer, and I know I'm dead. I can't get off. I go back and sit down. I watch Green. Just like Ace said, he controlled both backboards. At halftime, I'd seen enough. Michigan annihilated Northwestern. Ace had done his homework, and I hadn't. I learned a hell of a lesson. I found out I wasn't as smart as I thought I was. I had depended upon people for too much. I had given them the power to make up my mind for me, and I realized that if I wanted to spend my life gambling, pitting myself against the best bookmakers, there was no such thing as listening to people. If I was going to make a living doing this, I was going to have to figure it out for myself and do it all myself. I'd go to games with a tape recorder. I had spotters working for me. I'd tell some guys to just watch specific things. I'd have them watching 2 or 3 players only. I didn't care what else was happening. They had to watch who I told them to watch. I'd take their notes. Then I'd fly to the next town where the team played, and I'd watch them again. I'd match lineups. The final score is never the main thing to look at if you want to make money instead of losing it. I knew if a player had hurt his ankle and was playing slower. I knew when a quarterback was sick. I knew if his girlfriend got knocked up or left him for somebody else. I knew if he was smoking dope, snorting coke. I knew about injuries that didn't get in the papers, about injuries that players kept from their coaches. When I was 19, I got a job as a clerk at Bill Kaplan's sports service, Angel Kaplan. It's great. We'd be on the phones all day, taking action, passing it on, laying it off. Everyone from all over the country was hooked into each other. Now, I'm just a kid and still in Chicago, but now I'm hooked into the biggest office in the United States at the time, Gil Beckley's in Newport, Kentucky. Gil had the whole town of Newport locked up, the coppers, the politicians, the whole fucking town. Gil was Newport's main industry. He had 30 clerks working. He ran the biggest layoff operation in the country. It was where every bookmaking office in the country called to lay off bets if the action on one side was getting too heavy. For instance, if you're a bookmaker in Dallas, you are naturally going to get more Dallas bets than you want because you won't have enough people betting on the other side to offset any wins. So a Dallas bookmaker would call Gil Beckley's layoff operation, and Beckley's clerks would pick up enough of the Dallas bookmaker's bets to balance his book. Since Beckley is national, he can offset the Dallas bets against their opponents that week, and everything becomes even again. But the more I talked to Beckley, the more I realized the most unbelievable thing. If you ask Gil Beckley how many men were on a baseball team, he'd have to ask someone. Literally. He could not tell you. That wasn't one of his things. I'm being honest. Mickey Mantle? Who? Beckley just didn't know. He didn't have a fucking clue. But then he didn't have to know. He was a bookmaker and a layoff man. He didn't bet. He just ran the biggest accounting office in the country. I was stunned. But I found out pretty soon it didn't matter. All a layoff man's got to do is make sure he keeps the bets balanced and take his 10%. You don't have to be an expert on teams or even know about the games. I was amazed. But it turned out to be true. Lots of layoff men and bookies. Some of the biggest guys did not bet. I'd been working at Angel Kaplan a couple of years when Gil Beckley rented a couple of big suites at the Drake Hotel and invited me. There was some major fight in town. I don't remember exactly who was fighting, but I was feeling on top of the world. I had just been invited to a party by the most prominent bookmaker and layoff man in the United States. I knew I was picking up a little reputation at the time, and I felt like it was Gil's way of making me a part of the fraternity. There were no clients at this party, no high rollers, nothing like that. Everyone there was a professional, the top pros in the business, bookmakers, handicappers, layoff men, and a couple of professional players who made their livings by betting sports. But there were no suckers, no politicians. I'd never even seen Gil Beckley before. I'd been talking to him over the phone for a couple of years, talking to him 6, 7 times a day, and we're very friendly. Now when I meet him in person, he's really nice. He was surprised I was only in my early 20s. There were about 15 guys at the party, and every one of them had me by 20 or 30 or 40 years. So Beckley takes me around, introduces me to everybody in the room. It's spectacular. There was food and broads all over the place. He took care of the broads. And after the party is going for a while, he says to me, he called me Lefty. He didn't call me Frank. He said, "Lefty, I want to tell you something. You're a young fella. You got a very, very bright future. I'm going to tell you something that you need to keep precious to you for the rest of your life." He said, "I'd give half of what I own," and this is a wealthy man at the time, "if I was as clean as you. Stay that way. You got the brains, you got the know-how," he's telling me. "Keep clean." I never forgot that. But at the time, I didn't really know what he meant. I didn't respond. But he was telling me to play it smooth. Don't get pinched. Watch your reputation. Don't get labeled. I didn't listen to him. I didn't know how important those words were. I was too fucking young. I had too much energy. There was too much ego. There was too much of the challenge. I wanted to become the king of the whole fucking hill. Those worried about being arrested, bookmaking, a $50 fine. 10 days suspended sentence. Fuck the coppers. But Gil Beckley knew that. He knew everything that I knew, plus. He knew the price you had to pay when you got to be well known. He was warning me to play it safe, keep a low profile, stay away from the limelight. He didn't say this, but I could sense he meant for me to stay away from being too closely associated with outfit guys. I just listened to Beckley and nodded. But I'm full of young blood. I'm ready to challenge the world. I know what I'm doing. I can handle it. About a week after the party, I saw Jaime the Ace. I know he had been invited, but he never showed. I told him he had missed a great party. I told him I finally got to meet Gil Beckley and that he was a great guy. Ace looked at me like I was diseased. He didn't want to hear about the party. He didn't care who was there, Gil Beckley or anybody. But then, Ace never wanted to know about anything. He had no interest in street gossip or in outfit guys or in anything except his basketball. Ace never went to parties, never went to outfit restaurants or hangouts. And as a result, the Ace never took a pinch in his life.
Tony the Ant Spilatro grew up in a 2-story wooden gray bungalow in an Italian neighborhood just a few blocks from Lefty's home. Tony and his 5 brothers, Vincent, Victor, Patrick, Johnny, and Michael, slept in one room in 3 sets of bunk beds. Tony's father, Patsy, owned Patsy's restaurant at the corner of Grand and Ogden Avenues. It was a small place, famous for homemade meatballs that attracted customers from all over town, including outfit guys, like Tony Accardo, Paul the Waiter Rica, Sam Giancana, Gussie Alex, and Jackie Cerrone. Patsy's parking lot was often used for mob meetings. Frank Collada, who became part of Spilatro's crew, met Tony when the two were kids. Like Tony, Frank was born on the south side of Chicago. Collada was a thief. He had been one as far back as he could remember. He started boosting stores and apartments when he was 12, the year his father was killed, driving a getaway car in an armed robbery.
Tony and I didn't like each other. We both had shine boxes, and I would shine shoes on one side of Grand Avenue, and Tony would shine shoes on the other side of the street. We had a big argument. He told me I had to stay on my side of the street. I told him he had to stay on his. We started shoving. Nothing really came of it. And he went on his way, and I went on mine. Tony and I were both little short guys, you know. And he was a little shorter than me, so he didn't scare me at all. But Tony always had a lot of guys hanging around him. He used to have about 15 guys that used to follow him around. I had about 6 guys that hung with me. And one day, he was talking to his brother about me, and his father heard my last name. He told Tony to find out if I was Joe Collada's kid. My father was an independent bad guy, and a long time ago, Spilatro's father was getting shaken down by some old greaseball blackhanders. He went to my father, and my father straightened it out. So when it turned out that I was Joe Collada's son, Tony's father said that was the end of our feud. The next day, Tony walked up to me and said, "I want to talk to you." I said I wasn't running away, and he said, "My father and your father were friends, and we're going to be friends forever." From the moment we became friends, Tony and I ran the streets. Tony and I stole together. We'd have one guy outside a bank and one guy inside. The guy inside would stand on line, and he would spot the people who were taking out lots of cash and bringing it back to their businesses to cash checks for customers or whatever. There was usually between 3,000 and 12,000 in a bag. The man outside would watch everyone who left the bank, and he'd remember which way they went. Then we'd follow them until we got their route down, because you knew they were going to do it over and over again. The next time, we were waiting for them. We're 17, 18 years old, and we're making $25,000 a month apiece. We were doing really good. But Tony didn't just want to be a thief, like all of us anymore. He wanted to be a racketeer. Within a couple of years, Tony starts hanging with a guy by the name of Vinny the Saint in Cerro, who was even shorter than Tony. He was about 5'1", but he was the guy who introduced Tony to all the outfit guys. As these guys got bigger, Tony stayed close. He did whatever they wanted. "Brahma," he said to me one day. He used to call me Brahma because I was built like a bull. "Brahma," he said, "one of these days I'm going to be the boss of the whole syndicate." I never cared that much. I was more interested in money, enjoying myself. But Tony was waiting for an opportunity to make his bones, and that came right around here. There were two sharp stick-up men we knew, named Billy McCarthy and Jimmy Miraglia. I did some work with them. They had been hanging around an outfit lounge on Mannheim Road, getting loaded and getting into arguments with Philly and Ronnie Scalvo. The next time I see McCarthy and Miraglia, they tell me they're going to kill the Scalvos. I said they were nuts. If the outfit ever heard they killed the Scalvos without an okay, they'd be dead. The next morning, it was on my way home, about 7:30 in the morning. I'm listening to the radio when a newscast come on and said 2 men and a lady were gunned down in Elmwood Park, gangland style, early in the morning. And it gave their names. I knew this was disaster. First, McCarthy and Miraglia didn't have an okay for the hit. Second, it's definitely out of the question to kill anyone in Elmwood Park. So far, they're 2 for 2. I started to get worried about myself, because everybody knew I had been doing business with the 2 guys. That day, Spilatro calls and says he wants to meet with me. I met him in the bowling alley. He was all business. I could tell he was on an assignment from the boys. I knew this was where he was going to prove himself, and I didn't want to be his proof. I had 2 guns with me, just to be sure. 2 .38 snubs. I was scared and ready for trouble. When Tony came in, he told me that I had no problems, but I had to call McCarthy at home and tell him to meet me that night. I was supposed to tell McCarthy that I had a great score lined up. I didn't tell him what McCarthy and Miraglia had threatened to do, and since he didn't ask to talk to Miraglia, I hoped maybe the outfit guys weren't sure who did it as yet. I called, and Billy's wife answered. She said, "Hi, Frank," and she got Billy. I told him to meet me at the chicken house, which was located in Melrose Park, another outfit suburb. I told him I wanted to show him a very good score I found. Tony never let me out of his sight. About 8:30, we started to drive over to the chicken house in my car. But we stopped at another restaurant on the way. We didn't go into the place. Tony just had me pull around in the back of the parking lot. And there was a guy sitting in a dark blue Ford waiting for us. The guy in the car waiting for us was Vinny Insero, the saint himself. We pulled up to his car, and Tony walked over. They talked a minute, and then Tony came back and told me to wait in the car with the saint. Then Tony jumped into my car and drove away. I sat with the saint for about 40 minutes. All the while I sat in the car with him, I kept one hand on my gun. The car we're sitting in was definitely a work car, and the saint and I said absolutely nothing to each other the whole time. Tony rolled up about 40 minutes later in my car. He walked over to where we were sitting and told the saint he had to drive him back to the chicken house to pick up Billy McCarthy's car. Tony also told the saint everything went fine. When they drove off, I got in my car and drove home. The next day, my phone rang. It was Billy's wife. She asked me if I had seen Billy last night. I told her no and asked why. She said it wasn't unusual for Billy to stay out all night without calling her. But Billy had used her father's car last night, and he never pulled a shot like that on her father. 2 days later, Jimmy Miraglia disappeared. 11 days later, both of their bodies showed up in Jimmy's car trunk. About a week after the bodies popped up, Tony called. He was excited. He wanted to talk. Tony said they didn't kill Billy right away because they didn't know who was with him when the Scalvos were murdered. He said they had to torture Billy for a long time before he would give up who was with him. They had to beat him, kick him, even put an ice pick through his balls, but Billy never gave them nothing. Tony said he never saw anybody as tough as Billy McCarthy. Finally, Tony said he dragged Billy over to a workbench and put his head in a vise, and he started screwing it tighter and tighter. He said while Phil and Chucky watched, he kept tightening the vise until Billy's head began to squish together and one of his eyes popped out. Tony said that's when Billy gave up Jimmy Miraglia's name. Tony really sounded like he was very proud of what he accomplished that night. Seems as though it was the first time he had ever killed anyone. It was like he made his bones. That's the way it appeared to me at the time. Like he was recognized now that he participated in a mob hit. I remember he was really impressed with Chucky Nicoletti. Boy, this is a heartless guy, Tony said about Chucky. This guy was eating pasta when Billy's eye popped out.
Lefty had nothing to do with the violent end of the outfit's business. He grew up knowing most of the same bosses as Spilatro. He just provided them with a different service. He provided them with the very likely possibility of winning bets. Tony Spilatro was living the outfit life. He had teams of burglars like Frank Collada's working all over town, and they kicked in between 10 and 20% of their takes to him. Tony was basically in the mob's main business, franchising crime. Frank Collada was with Tony's crew for 5 years before he ever met Lefty Rosenthal.
I was with his burglars and goons. Lefty was part of his gambling stuff. Mad Sam was with his loan sharking and leg breaking. Tony liked to keep everybody separate. Lefty was weird. You couldn't read him. Tony loved to hang around him because even then, Lefty was one of the best handicappers in the country, bar none. We'd be hanging around on a Friday night before putting down our bets. Tony would ask Lefty, "What about Kansas?" And Lefty would just say, "I have no opinion." Then Tony would ask him, "What about Rutgers Holy Cross?" And Lefty would say, "No opinion." Now Tony's got this list of college games printed with the odds as long as a supermarket tape. And he's going down it game by game, and he's throwing every one of them at Lefty. and Lefty's standing there, leaning against the bar, drinking his Mountain Valley water, watching some fight rerun on the TV, and he's just no-opinioning Tony to death. Finally, Tony blows up. He grabs the list and shoves it in Lefty's hands. "Here, you pick 'em. Pick 'em yourself." Without hardly taking his eyes off the fight, Lefty takes Tony's list, makes 2 quick little pencil marks on it, and hands it right back to Tony. Tony looks at the list. Lefty keeps looking at the TV. "Hey," Tony says, "what is this? I've got 100 plays here. Every college basketball team in the country is playing this weekend, and you give me 2 picks?" Lefty looks down at Tony like he's a bug. "I assumed you wanted to win," he says. "Of course I want to win, but I want to have some fun, too. Why don't you loosen up for once, for Christ's sake?" "How much are you betting?" Lefty asked. "Couple of grand, whatever. What are you betting?" "I'm wagering more than that," Lefty says. Lefty almost never said he'd bet. He was always wagering, having an opinion or taking a position. "More than what?" Tony jumps on him. "You're only playing 2 fucking games. What the hell did you bet?" "You don't want to know," says Lefty. "I do want to know." Lefty gets close to Tony and he says very quietly, under his breath, and I'm right there between them watching his lips as he says the words, "We were down for 50 each." There would be the day when Tony bet $50,000 and $60,000 on a football or basketball game, but not back then. We were still in our early 20s. Lefty was about 30. He was betting for himself and some pretty big people, outfit people, and we all know who they were. "Oh, excuse me," Tony says, grabbing the list and going down it game by game again. "I forgot who I'm talking to. I shouldn't even be alive. I'm betting nickels and dimes over here."
According to the feds, Fiore Fifi Buccieri, the outfit's boss of the West Side, was one of the men who profited the most from Lefty's early handicapping talents. He was a scholarly-looking man with a stocky build, eyeglasses, and a partial upper dental plate. He started his criminal career as a juvenile delinquent, and at the age of 19, he was already a top enforcer for Al Capone. His arrests dated back to 1925, and he had been charged with extortion, bribery, larceny, and murder. His only conviction came on a burglary charge that was reduced to petty larceny. Lefty had known the solemn-looking street boss most of his life. Lawmen suspect that Lefty's family knew Buccieri since the mob boss and Lefty's father were in the same close-knit fruit and vegetable supply business. By 1950, when Lefty was 20, he was already spotted traveling around the city with Buccieri. At the end of a day at the track, Buccieri would often invite Lefty to drive around with him for a few hours, according to the feds. Usually, young bookmakers and handicappers were kept far away from the men who controlled the outfit, but according to the FBI, the Chicago Police, and the Chicago Crime Commission, Rosenthal occupied a unique place with the outfit's bosses. As a result of his friendship with up-and-coming outfit bosses, Rosenthal always had unusual access to the outfit's top echelon. Since he was Jewish and could never be a member of the organization, he did not have to abide by many of the traditional rules of protocol that restricted aspiring members or even made men. According to the feds, Lefty acquired this unique position because he made them money. First, he was a great handicapper, and second, he was able to provide the kind of inside betting information denied even mob bosses. According to a retired FBI official, the outfit's top guys would call Lefty in whenever there was a question about their gambling operations. He was like the boss's troubleshooter. He could question people, even made men. And while Lefty was not a part of the outfit's violence machine, it was never very far away.
There was this one time when Buccieri had everybody in Chicago terrified. I heard about this story at the time, but later Tony told me what happened. As crazy as it might seem, some psycho had actually gone to Fiore Buccieri's house with a gun and robbed Fiore's wife. When Buccieri got home, he was insane. He wanted to know everything. The guy took about $400,000 in cash and almost all of the wife's jewelry. Since the guy hadn't even bothered to wear a mask, he was probably not local. But Fiore had the cops bring him a dozen mugshot books, and he made his wife go through thousands of pages looking for the guy's face. 2 weeks later, Buccieri still doesn't know who robbed him, and he's going wild. And everybody's terrified. If he even suspects you know what happened, you're dead. But the truth was, nobody knew anything. Then one guy who was looking to make a few points with Buccieri says the only guy he knew who might be crazy enough to maybe know somebody who could do such a thing was Tony Spilatro. Buccieri sends the word he wants Tony to show up at his house. Tony knows Lefty is close with Buccieri, and he said he asked Lefty if he knew what the old man wanted. Lefty said he didn't know, and they go to see Buccieri together. When they got there, Tony said Buccieri had 2 guys the size of refrigerators in the doorway. When he walked inside, Fiore's wife glared at him like he was the devil. He said now he was not very happy. He and Lefty were led down into the basement, where Buccieri tells Tony to sit down in a chair. Tony said Buccieri didn't pay any attention to Lefty, who was just standing there in the dark. Then Buccieri looks at Tony and asks him, "Do you know what happened to me?" "Yeah," Tony says. "I'm sorry." "I didn't ask you that," Buccieri says. "Just answer my question." "Yes," Tony says, I heard about it." "Do you have any idea who fits that M.O.?" Buccieri says. "No," Tony says, like he's getting a little annoyed. "Are you sure?" Fiore asks. Now Tony gets pissed, and he says, maybe a little sarcastically, "I already answered that question." Before his mouth was closed, Tony said Buccieri had him by the throat, and he started strangling Tony right there. Tony thought he was going to die. Tony said he began to lose his breath. He started to gag and feel weak. And then he realized that Lefty was standing right next to him, and that Lefty was begging Buccieri to stop. He could hear Lefty say that if Tony knew who did it, he would have already given the guy up. Lefty said that Tony had a stupid mouth, but he didn't mean to be disrespectful. Tony said he could see Lefty talking right into Buccieri's ear until finally Buccieri let go. Tony was gagging and coughing. He was dizzy. Buccieri looked at him and said, "If I find out you know what took place in my home and didn't tell me, I'll wipe out your whole family." Tony said even though Lefty saved his life, he and Lefty got out of there before the old man changed his mind.
By the late 1950s, before the horror of drugs had invaded the country, illegal gamblers were considered public enemy number 1. In 1960, Lefty Rosenthal had his first pinch as a bookmaker. His name suddenly appeared on various lists of KGs, known gamblers, churned out for the press by the Chicago Crime Commission. In 1961, at the age of 30, Lefty Rosenthal moved on. He decided to go out on his own, stop making money for other people, and start playing for himself. He moved to Miami. His father had gone down there with some of his horses, and it seemed like the right thing to do. He was going to play small. He had $5,000 of his own to invest, and 2 guys took a piece of him at $5,000 each. By the end of the college basketball season, with 2 weeks to go, he had moved their $15,000 bankroll up to $750,000. In 1961, the newly appointed Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy started looking into the connections between the mob, illegal gambling, and the Teamsters Union. The FBI already knew most of the players. They knew more about what was happening within the mob than many of the mobsters. Frank Rosenthal's connections to the Chicago outfit were well known. In Miami, he had been spotted in the company of Chicago street bosses like Turk Torello, Milwaukee Phil, Jackie Cerrone, and Fiore Buccieri. The Bureau believed that in addition to betting in Miami, he was also booking bets. An arrest by the local police raised his profile high enough to guarantee a friendly visit from the feds, asking him to become an informer in exchange for immunity. He refused, and subsequently a subpoena from the McClellan Subcommittee on Gambling and Organized Crime arrived. Lefty got a lawyer and flew to Washington and found himself being accused of attempting to bribe Michael Bruce, a 25-year-old University of Oregon halfback. Lefty has denied that he ever tried to bribe anyone, but when he took the stand before the McClellan Committee, his lawyers advised him that if he answered one question, even an innocuous one, he would have to answer everything he was asked or be held in contempt and very likely jailed. His appearance before the committee was a fiasco. Lefty took the Fifth Amendment 37 times. Lefty went back to Florida, but the heat was on. Robert Kennedy had pushed a bill through Congress prohibiting the interstate transmission of any gambling information, making Lefty's phone calls about team injuries, lineups, odds, and even weather conditions against the law and subjecting him to arrest. In 1962, when the FBI's long-awaited crackdown on gamblers arrived, and J. Edgar Hoover personally announced the arrests of hundreds of gamblers and mobsters all around the country, Lefty was among those arrested. Over the next year, he was routinely arrested for bookmaking, handicapping, traffic infractions, using profanity, disorderly conduct, loitering, and gambling. On one occasion, Lefty got into a traffic dispute with two men who turned out to be federal agents. He said he and the agents were on a side street near Biscayne Boulevard. Lefty had been on his way to a popular restaurant nearby. He knew they were agents because he had just been ticketed for failing to signal a right turn by the local cops. The agents had been tagging along right behind the police and started cursing him while he was being given the ticket. Lefty said the cops giving him the ticket acknowledged they were FBI agents.
One night I was driving down a very dark road in Miami, and a couple of agents were behind me. This actually happened. I swear to you, it happened. It's a real dark road, and it's very narrow, and this car's closing in on me, and they pull me over, and I stop. And two agents identify themselves, and they start giving me some shit, and I gave it right back to them. One of them was a real big guy. We were in this wooded area. He got out of the car, physically pushed me off to the side, and he said, "We finally got you. We're going to take you into the fucking woods and beat you to a pulp." And he looked like he meant it. As he's talking, who's driving the other way on that street by mere accident, so help me God? Tony Spilatro. He sees my car, he pulls over, he gets out of the car, he challenges both of the fucking agents. He went nose to nose, and he's only 5'2" or 5'3". He says, "You two gutless sons of bitches, you ain't going to do nothing to him." So help me God. Now, Tony and I grew up together. I used to say I knew him from the time he was conceived. We frequented the same places in Chicago. But the relationship really grew more from North Miami.
By 1967, Frank Rosenthal's fight with the state of Florida ended, and it became clearer to him after every weekend that he should have been playing in Las Vegas, where he could sit down and watch the numbers until he was ready to pounce. Lefty was on his way to Las Vegas, and so was his rap sheet. The Chicago Crime Commission was preparing to alert the Las Vegas police that Frank Lefty Rosenthal, a 38-year-old outfit bookmaker, handicapper, and layoff man, was about to arrive.
I'm not in Las Vegas a week before there's a knock on the door. I remember I had the flu. It was the coppers. I let him in. "What can I do for you?" "You're under arrest." "What for?" "Burglary," they say. "That's nuts," I say. I am genuinely amazed. I know I haven't done anything. After a night in the can, I was put on a plane for Chicago the next morning. After a few days calling around, I made arrangements to return. They hassled me only because I had such a hot profile. The FBI and the Chicago cops said I had all kinds of affiliations, but at that point, the truth was I was strictly freelance, so I went back. I moved into the Tropicana Hotel. I was spending all my time in the hotel room reading the newspapers. At that time, my focus was keen. I was betting against the biggest bookmakers in the country, and I was way ahead. That season, I won every game of Monday Night Football except one. After a while, the fun was in watching the spread change, and knowing it was because of me. I'd see the game open at 6, nice and stable, no secrets. The game shouldn't go below 5 or above 7, 1 point, either way. But back then, when I was moving, I was able to move the spread on a game by as much as 3 points. I'd go home to watch each game. I'd turn off the phone. If I had a big wager on a game, I never watched with anyone. I watched it all by myself. I was too involved. I didn't want to be distracted. Meanwhile, I'd met Jerry. She was a dancer at the Tropicana. She was the most beautiful girl I ever saw. She was tall, statuesque, great posture. And everyone who met her liked her in 5 minutes. The girl had fantastic charm. No matter where we went, people would turn around to look at her. She was that striking. When I met her, she was also a chip hustler. She was a working girl. She had a couple of guys who she went with, and she made about $300,000 a year. I used to meet her after work, but the more I used to go out with her, the more I saw in her. I realized that I was changing my attitude toward her one night when I went over to see her dance at the Trop. When she came out, I saw that she was dancing topless. Now, suddenly, it bothered me. I walked out. Later, I told her that I saw her, but that I had to leave before the end of the show. She didn't give it much thought. She just thought I was busy. I don't think it even dawned on Jerry that I was beginning to feel differently about her. One night she said she had an appointment at the dunes and that she'd meet me later. I don't know, but I just got curious. I wanted to see what she was up to, who she was with. So I did what I had never done. I went over to the dunes to see her in action. When I got there, the place was hot. She was throwing pass after pass at the craps table, and the guy with her was stacking rack after rack. She must have pulled in $60,000 for the guy, judging by the racks of $100 chips he had in front of him. She looked up, and when she saw me, she gave me a dirty look. I knew she didn't like that I'd come by to see her, so she rolled again and crapped out. Meanwhile, she had made the guy a small fortune. Of course, every time she made a pass, I noticed that she was snatching little black $100 chips off his pile and dropping them into her purse. When the guy was getting ready to cash in the roll, Jerry looked at him and asked, "Where's my end?" The guy looked at her purse and said, "You already taken your end in there." It's understood after a girl makes a run like that for you, you give her 5, 6, 7 grand. Jerry hadn't picked up anything like that, even in $100 chips. "I want my end," she said very loudly. The guy reaches for her purse. He's going to empty her purse right there in front of us. But before he can do that, Jerry leans over and grabs his chip racks and tosses them into the air as high as she can. Suddenly, the whole casino was raining $100 black chips and $25 green chips. They're falling and bouncing off the tables, people's heads and shoulders, and rolling along the floor. Within seconds, everybody in the casino was diving for chips. I mean, players, dealers, pit bosses, security guards, everybody's fishing for the guy's chips on the floor. The guy she was with is screaming and scooping up as many as he can, and the security guys and dealers are handing him 6 and pocketing 3. It's a wild scene. At that point, I cannot take my eyes off her. She's standing there like royalty. She and I are the only 2 people in the whole casino who aren't on the floor. She looks over at me, and I'm looking at her. "You like that, huh?" she says, and walks out the door. That's when I realized I'd fallen in love.
When Lefty met her, Jerry McGee had been hustling in Las Vegas for about 8 years. She owned her own house. She was raising an 11-year-old daughter, Robin Marmer, whose father was Jerry's high school sweetheart, Lenny Marmer. She supported her ailing mother, Alice, and her sister Barbara, who had been abandoned with 2 young sons by her husband. Occasionally, Lenny Marmer would visit Jerry and their daughter for 2 or 3 days, usually to borrow money for a surefire business deal. Occasionally, Jerry's father, Roy McGee, would visit. Jerry earned between $300,000 and $500,000 a year hustling chips and partying with high rollers. She made about $20,000 a year as a dancer at the Tropicana, a job that provided her with a work card issued by the Las Vegas Sheriff's Office, showing that she was gainfully employed. Having a work card kept her from being harassed for hustling in a casino by Las Vegas vice cops and hotel security. And Jerry got along because she gave everybody a few bucks whenever she scored. Smart girls like Jerry tipped everyone in sight. She cast her money on the waters and expected it to come back tenfold. Jerry McGee and her sister Barbara grew up in Sherman Oaks and went to Van Nuys High School with Robert Redford and Don Drysdale. Their father, Ray McGee, worked in gas stations and tinkered. Their mother, Alice, had been hospitalized for mental illness. When she was well, she took in ironing. According to Barbara McGee Stokich, they were probably the poorest family in the neighborhood. They babysat, raked leaves, and fed people's chickens and rabbits. They got all their clothes from the neighbors. Jerry hated it. Jerry started going out with Lenny Marmer in high school. He was the sharpest guy in school. He wore sunglasses indoors. Jerry was only 15. Barbara says that Jerry and Lenny used to dance together, ballroom dancing by the hour. They won silver cups and prizes dancing in contests all over the valley and at the Hollywood Palladium. Jerry won bathing suit contests and little modeling jobs. Nobody in the family liked Lenny, but he was always hanging around, acting like he was Jerry's agent. She didn't want her family to see him in his dark glasses. In 1954, when Jerry graduated, her Aunt Ingram, who inherited a lot of money when her husband died, offered to send Jerry to Woodbury Business School, which is where she had sent Barbara 2 years earlier. But Jerry didn't want to go to Woodbury. She wanted to go to UCLA or USC. The aunt refused. She wouldn't do more for Jerry than she had done for Barbara, so Jerry said, "No, thank you." Jerry had an apartment, and Lenny moved in, and he started taking her to Hollywood parties to meet people. In 1958, their daughter Robin was born, and Lenny talked Jerry into moving to Las Vegas. He could, Barbara believes, talk her into anything. Lenny used to say he was a professional pool shooter. He used to say he was a car salesman. But the truth, Barbara says, is that she doesn't remember him ever working. Lenny stayed in Los Angeles, but he said Jerry could make real money in Vegas. Her mother moved out there with her to keep an eye on Robin. Jerry was already seeing Frank in 1968 when Barbara moved in with her. Jerry had saved her money. She had blue-chip stocks, but she was over 30, and she talked about how it couldn't last. She started talking more and more about getting married. She didn't want to live the way she was living anymore. She told her sister that she was going to find somebody to marry. Frank Rosenthal and Jerry McGee were married May 1st, 1969, by Justice of the Peace Joseph Pawlikowski.
I knew Jerry didn't love me when we got married. There was never any question. But I was so attracted to her. When I proposed, I thought I could build a nice family, nice relationship. For her peace of mind and security, I agreed to put some money away for her. She wanted about $1 million, and she wanted it in jewelry. I accommodated her. We put it in safety deposit boxes. After we were married, Jerry used to go to the bank, open the boxes, and just look at the stones. Before we got married, we talked about the fact that you can build or create a form of love, admiration, respect. And what is love? I talked to her about that, but I wasn't fooled. She married me because of what I stood for. Security, strength, well-connected fella, well-respected fella, would probably make a good father. And she was getting older. She didn't want to chip hustle anymore, fuck around with her players. She wanted to be respectable, quit her job at the Tropicana. And I thought I could mold Jerry. I didn't give a fuck if she drinks too much. So what? I'll stop that in one day. I didn't know about alcoholism. How could I know about it? I never drank. All I knew about was handicapping and handicapping. That's all I knew. At the wedding, she got up and went to a public phone booth to make a call. When I went out to see if she was okay, I could hear her talking to Lenny Marmer. I could hear her telling him she had just married Frank Rosenthal. As she spoke, I saw that she was crying. I could hear her saying, "Lenny, I'm sorry. I love you. This is the best thing I can do." She's saying goodbye to the love of her life. She hung up the phone, and she saw me. She told me it was something she had to do. I told her I understood that. But the past was now the past. We were now married. Life would be different. I took the drink out of her hand, and we walked back into the wedding. So, we got married. Tremendous. It was a hell of a night. Maybe 500 people. Her family, my family, friends, caviar, lobsters, Cristal champagne for 500 people. They erected a chapel in Caesar's Palace. I had no idea what my bill was. My wedding was comped.
Tony Spilotro was 10 years younger than his old friend Frank Rosenthal, but by 1971 their lives were on an oddly parallel course. Both of them were public figures for all the wrong reasons. Both of them had been arrested many times. In Lefty's case for a series of minor infractions, in Tony's for a series of infractions considerably more minor than the ones he'd actually committed. Both of them had handled the arrests by suing authorities, and as a result of the heat, both of them chose to change their lives by going west. When Tony Spilotro got to town in 1971, Las Vegas was a relatively quiet place. The bosses had been making so much money from their own illegitimate enterprises such as illegal bookmaking, loan sharking, and casino skimming that there was a concerted effort by the mob to keep the town clean, safe, and quiet. The rules were simple. Disputes were to be peaceably settled. There were to be no shootings or car explosions in town. Bodies were not to be left in car trunks at the airport. Sanctioned murders took place out of town, or the bodies disappeared forever in the vast desert surrounding the city. Tony changed the way business was done in Las Vegas. He took over. The first thing he did was bring in some of his own men and impose a street tax on every bookie, loan shark, drug dealer, and pimp in town. A few, like a bookmaker named Jerry Delman, resisted, but he wound up shot dead in a daylight robbery in the garage area behind his house. Nobody tried to hide the body. It was a message that there was a real gangster in town. Tony understood very quickly that he could run Las Vegas any way he wanted, because the bosses were 1,500 miles away and didn't have the same kind of street ears in Las Vegas that they had back in Elmwood Park. When Frank Collada got out of prison after doing 6 years for a Brinks truck robbery, Tony suggested he come out to Nevada as soon as he got off parole.
By the time I got there, Tony was already running the town. He had everybody on the payroll. He owned a couple of guys in the sheriff's office. He had guys in the courthouse who could get him grand jury minutes. And he had people in the telephone company to tell about phone taps. Tony had the town covered. He was in the papers all the time. He had broads coming around in Rolls Royces who wanted to go out with him. Everybody wanted to be around a gangster. Movie stars, everybody. I didn't know what the fuck's the attraction, but that's the way it was. I guess it's a feeling of power, you know. People feel like, well, these guys are hitters, and if I need something done, they'll do it for me. He told me, look, Frank, get a crew together, and whatever you gotta fucking do with the guys, you got my okay. Just give me my end. You've got carte blanche out here. I sent for Wayne Matecki, Larry Newman, Ernie Davino, real desperados like that, and we started putting the arm on everybody. Bookmakers, Shylocks, dope dealers, pimps. Shit, we'd strong-arm them, beat them, shoot their fucking guard dogs. What did we care? I had Tony's okay. In fact, half the time, Tony told us who to grab. Then, after we'd robbed them and scared them, they'd run to Tony for protection to get us off their backs. They never had any idea it was Tony who sent us over to rob them in the first place. We made good money turning over houses. It was all cash and jewelry. I'm talking about $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 in 20s and 100s laying in dresser drawers. One time, I found 15 $1,000 bills next to a guy's bed. Now, where the fuck am I going to get rid of them? $1,000 bills are hard to get rid of. Banks want your name if you try and cash them. So I pushed them at the Stardust. I handed them to the dealer, and he shoved them in the drawer and gave me back 15 grand in hundreds. If the doors and windows and alarm systems were a pain, we'd go right through the wall. Going through the walls was my idea. I invented it. It's very simple. Almost all the houses out in Vegas have stucco exterior walls. All you need is a 5-pound sledge to make a hole big enough so you can get in. Then you use metal shears to clip away the chicken wire inside the wall they use for lathing. Then you bang away a little more until you break through the interior drywall and you're inside the house. You could only do this in Las Vegas. because the houses were stucco and they have high walls around them for privacy. People have pools and things outside, and they like to live private lives. Nobody knows their neighbors. Nobody wants to know their neighbors. It's that kind of town. It's the kind of place, if people hear a noise from the house next door, they tune it out. We did so many of these jobs that the newspaper started calling us the hole-in-the-wall gang. The cops never knew who we were. Main fucking pigs, Tony'd say. Proud of us. Look what I have created out here. Looking back, I see how crazy we were. Here we were in Las Vegas with a million ways to make a dishonest buck. And Tony's got us out here doing house burglaries and armed robberies and 7-Elevens. It was dumb.
Lefty Rosenthal was 41. He had had enough of life as a freelancer. He was running a betting and booking office called the Rose Bowl, and he had been arrested 6 times in a 4-month period. He was tired of 18-hour days and continuous harassment by John Law. It was time to pack it in. Get a steady gig. Settle down. Of course, at the time, Las Vegas was the only city in the world where settling down means going to work in a casino.
In 1971, Jerry asked me to quit gambling and get a regular job, lend some respectability to the family now that we had a son. She wanted us to live a normal life. Jerry felt squeezed out. She said Stephen, our son, felt squeezed out. I felt I owed it to her at least to try to live a regular life for a while. She said, take the same energy you're using betting every week and use it inside a casino. I said, okay. Filled out a few applications. I had some friends at the Stardust. I got a job as a floor man. That's one step above a dealer. I got $60 a day. I pulled an 8 or 9-hour shift. I was in charge of watching 4 blackjack tables. Now, the Stardust Hotel and Casino was built in 1959. It was the first high-rise casino hotel on the Strip. And though it had passed through several owners, it had always been controlled by the Chicago mob. It was famous mostly for having the largest sign in Las Vegas, with 932 electric bulbs in the A alone, and for being the home of the Lido show. It was considered a grind joint, a place where players lost slowly and steadily rather than spectacularly. The high rollers went to Caesars and the Desert Inn. I never entertained the idea of working in a casino until my wife suggested it, but once I started working there, I became intrigued. I never saw such a business where people were so anxious to give you their money. Give them a free drink and a dream, and they give you their wallets. It was next to impossible for a casino not to make money, but some casinos had to win their money 2 or 3 times because the people running them were so lazy or crooked. I saw casino managers laying back. They lived in a comfort zone. I could never be that way. My job was to hang around the pit, but on a busy night I'd walk around on the outside of the pit behind the dealers and look at their backs and see if they were lifting their hole cards too high. Then I'd go over to them and say, "That's a good-looking 10 of spades you got there." I found out that it was a very common practice in casinos where they had a weak operation for one hustler to sit behind a weak dealer showing hole cards and signal his compadre playing at the weak dealer's table. They use head signals, eyes, hands, even impulse transmitters. Some of them were crossroaders, professional casino cheats, and they'd been photographed and listed in the Black Book. They'd come in wearing fake beards, wigs, phony noses. They'd have partners counting cards, spraying the roulette wheel, dropping balonies onto a craps table, and using special magnets to get slot machine wins. They'd create any kind of diversion so one of them could slide card-dealing shoes onto a blackjack table. They can usually do this only with the help of the dealer and pit boss, and bang you out for a couple of $100,000, which you never see again. I started looking for little signals, clues. I learned that if a crapshooter's hands were not open after he tosses the dice, he could be palming balonies. There are people so fast that it's not possible to see them put fake dice on the table. They work in teams and specialize. The person who slips in the dice can turn out to be a nice little old lady. It's usually not the shooter. The person who rolls the fake dice on the table usually leaves soon after. You can't prevent an expert getting bad dice on the table, but your pit boss or shift boss should be able to pick it up as the play begins. After a while, you begin to learn all the games. You learn to be careful about distractions. People spilling drinks, asking a dealer for a cigarette, starting an argument with a dealer, stopping a dealer and asking for change. I learned to spot a sub, a long sock sewn into a dealer's clothes where he can slide the chips he steals off the tables. One clue to a sub is that crooked dealers are constantly touching themselves. I looked to see if a dealer's boots were extended over his pants. Take off open-top boots, and 9 times out of 10 you'll find chips inside. The first week I worked in the casino, I caught a dealer slipping chips under his chronograph wristwatch. There were also turns, which is what they call people who help slot cheats. Now, they're called turns because they turn the floorman away with questions like, "Pardon me, can you tell me where the bathroom is?" while their partners cluster around the machines, blocking the view. And one of the crew opens the machine or places magnets inside that will spin off winners. Doesn't take long. Good slot man can get inside a machine in seconds. I wasn't in the pits more than 3 or 4 months when the gaming control board comes down on me. Wow, Frank Rosenthal's in the pits. Shannon Bybee, a member of the gaming control board at the time, puts a full court press on me and tries to get me knocked out of the building. They were insisting that I would have to have a key employee license if I was going to work at the casino. And my going for a key license in front of their kangaroo court was a waste. Meanwhile, I started to dodge and weave. I'm trying to sustain myself in the building any way I can, hoping to wait them out and get past the control board heat. So I changed jobs. I took a job in the hotel that didn't come under gaming regulations, so I wouldn't have to deal with the control board. I became an executive for the hotel's public relations department. I had cards made up. I was working PR, but believe me, I did not miss much on the floor or in the pits. Bybee was still trying to nail me. He couldn't stand it that I had thumbed my nose at the control board. The control board could make life very tough for a casino, and after a while, Alan Sachs, the president of the casino, was ready to fire me. He told people he didn't want to take any of the heat. Right in the middle of all this, a friend of mine calls up. He's planning to come into Vegas for a visit. I'm a nobody. I'm trying to hold on to my job. And he's calling about staying in a hotel, kind of incognito. Back then, the arrival in Las Vegas of a guy like that was like a papal visit. Al Sachs knew the name of my friend, but he'd never met the man. As a courtesy to Sachs, I said, "Is it okay if he stays at the Stardust?" If not, the guy himself had said he'd stay somewhere else. No big deal. I remember Sachs kind of hesitated and said the following: "No problem. And Frank, don't you think I ought to show my respects and meet him secretly?" I said, "Yeah, Al, I guess you can. That's up to you. That's your call." When my friend flew into Las Vegas, he checked into the Stardust just like anyone else, except he was under a different name. Then he paged me, and I went to his room, and we talked, caught up on things for a little bit. Then I told him that Al Sachs, the hotel's president, wanted to say hello to him. He said to me, this was the kind of guy he was, he said, "Why the fuck do I want to talk to him? I don't want to bother him. I don't want to put the heat on the guy." He said, "Forget about it, Frank." I said, "No, I think he'll be insulted. I think he feels he owes you that courtesy. You got to remember at this time, this man was a top guy in Chicago." I convinced him that it was best for both sides to just shake hands. I stood by the doors, and as my friend walks towards Sachs, I see Sachs about 20 feet away rush up to him with both arms extended, and he gives my friend a big hug. Remember, Sachs is the president of the Stardust Hotel and Casino. He's never met this man in his life. I can hear both their voices as I'm walking away, and I hear Sachs say, "Gee, it's a pleasure. I'm really happy. This is something I'll never forget." And then he says, "I'm really delighted to have Frank around. I know he's just like a son to you." My friend, real serious, says, "You're wrong." Sachs says, "What do you mean?" My friend says, "No, he's not like a son. He is my son." That was the last thing I heard, and then I kept on walking. After a while, things cooled off, and I moved back behind the pits.
All booming industries create jobs, and the Spilatro operation was no exception. Within a year, Tony Spilatro was providing work not just for his own crew, but for dozens of law enforcement officers who tailed him, bugged him, and attempted to ensnare him in elaborate stings. At one point, Spalatro was betting $30,000 a week at a bookmaking operation that was actually an IRS sting. He was attracted by the fact that it offered better odds than any other book in town. When the IRS agent operating the sting had the nerve to ask Spalatro for collateral, Spalatro greeted him with a baseball bat. "Do you know who I am?" Spalatro asked. "I run this town." The FBI got the necessary probable cause and dropped a mic in the ceiling of the back room of Spalatro's jewelry store, the Gold Rush. The front room was strictly for selling rings and wristwatches. Upstairs, Tony had anti-surveillance devices, telephone scramblers, battleship binoculars so he could see if he was being watched from a mile away, and shortwave radios that picked up police calls and were even able to unscramble the Bureau's frequencies. Tony got the frequencies through some Metro cops he had on his payroll. He also had an electronics expert from Chicago, Ronnie Balloonhead DeAngelis, who would fly into town every few weeks and sweep the place for taps and bugs. The Bureau always got its best stuff right after DeAngelis left. "Balloonhead says the place is clean," Tony would proudly announce, and everyone would relax. According to Bud Hall, Jr., a retired FBI agent who spent years eavesdropping on him, Tony was a totally focused human being. He woke up in the morning knowing exactly what he was going to do that day. He'd get dozens of calls at his Gold Rush jewelry store. He had all kinds of financial deals going on at the same time. He had different groups, hundreds of people, a million schemes, all of them in various stages of development. And even though most of them never panned out, he still had to put in a 16 to 18-hour day trying to put the deals together. It would have been difficult, Bud Hall observed, doing what Tony did if he had secretaries, a filing system, Xerox machines, and the free use of a phone. But Tony did it all off the cuff and kept it all in his head. Tony was the smartest and most efficient mobster Bud Hall had ever seen. His biggest problem was that he was surrounded by people who were always screwing up. As time passed, Spalatro spent less and less time with his wife, Nancy. When they were together, they fought, and the FBI listened. She complained that he had lost interest in her. She accused him of affairs. He was never home. He never talked to her. In the morning, the FBI recorded the sound of silence as Tony made his coffee and Nancy read the newspaper. Then he would leave for the store without even saying goodbye. Sometimes Nancy had to call him at work to relay a message. According to Bud Hall, Tony was always rude. Nancy would tell Dina, who managed the front of the Gold Rush, whenever Tony beat her up or whenever she suspected Tony was fooling around, and Dina kept Nancy informed about what Tony was doing. Bud Hall recalls a time when Dina called Nancy at home and said, "The bitch is here." Nancy jumped in the car and tore over to the place and started screaming at Cheryl, Tony's girlfriend, calling her a no-good cunt right there in the middle of the store. The FBI could hear the screaming on the wire, and then they hear Nancy screaming for Tony to stop hitting her. He was really beating her up. They got worried that he was going to kill her, so they called 911 and said they were in the Black Forest German restaurant next door and said someone was being assaulted in the Gold Rush. The FBI couldn't tell the cops who they were because at that point it looked like Tony owned Metro, and they didn't want to blow their surveillance. The police got there in a few minutes and everything calmed down. After 2 or 3 years, Lefty's marriage looked like a bad bet. Jerry had given birth to a son, Stephen, whom she adored, but she found the domestic life Lefty wanted her to live far too restrictive, especially since he refused to play by the rules he expected her to follow. Lefty was working day and night at the casino, and Jerry began to suspect he was seeing other women. She told her sister she had found receipts for jewelry and presents in his pockets when she took his suits to the dry cleaners. When she accused him of fooling around, he told her she was crazy. He accused her of being drunk and taking too many pills. So Jerry started going out. Sometimes she'd stay out all night. Sometimes she'd disappear for a weekend. On more than one occasion, Lefty hired private detectives to track her down. He would turn up at her favorite bars and demand that she come home immediately. Finally, he threatened to divorce her. He met with her in his lawyer's office and produced affidavits attesting to her addictions to alcohol and pills. He made it clear that her days of power and wealth were over, and that she would lose custody of her son as well. Jerry's sister, Barbara Stokich, recalls that Jerry didn't want to lose everything, but Lefty would only take her back if she agreed to have another child and make a greater effort at staying away from the pills and the liquor. According to Barbara, Jerry didn't want to have another child, but she felt that it was the only way she had to keep from getting thrown out on the street. She used to tell Barbara that Lefty was a very powerful man, that he owned the judges and courts, that she wouldn't stand a chance against him. They had Stephanie in 1973, but that didn't solve their problems. In fact, Barbara Stokich observes, in many ways it made things worse because Jerry always resented being forced to have Stephanie. Stephen was wonderful. Jerry loved having a boy. But being forced to have a child, and for that child to be a girl in competition with her daughter Robin, made Jerry very upset. She could never warm to Stephanie.
I knew things weren't going all that well at home, but I didn't know how bad they were for quite a while. Jerry was still hard to figure. Some days she'd wake up happy, and other times you couldn't be around her. Everything you said was a fight. She didn't like it when I got on her about her drinking, and she didn't like it when I got on her about letting Stephen, who was 7, beat up on Stephanie, who was only 3. Jerry just adored Stephen. She spoiled him rotten. He was her prize, a beautiful Gerber baby. She favored him over her daughter. Jerry had always lived her own life. She didn't want to change. Looking back, I think the only real reason she stayed with Lenny Marmer all those years, and remember, this is a guy who never even sent her a birthday card, was that Lenny never tried to stop her from doing anything she wanted to do. That was his power over her. He didn't care what she did as long as she made money. And I think Jerry preferred that to somebody like myself who was always after her about this and that and the other thing. When Jerry was hustling out there, Lenny didn't say, "Stop, I love you, I don't want you doing that anymore." No, sir. Lenny let her do whatever she wanted. He didn't care. Drink, sure. Take pills, okay. Lenny never told her not to do anything because she was making money. Then I come along. And probably for the first time in her life, there's a guy laying down rules. Well, Jerry never took to anybody's rules but her own.
Alan Glick was tougher than he looked. In 1974, when the 31-year-old San Diego real estate developer suddenly became the second biggest casino operator in Las Vegas history, many of the state's gaming regulators and casino owners were astounded. Glick had arrived in Las Vegas only a year earlier, when he and 3 partners obtained a $3 million loan to develop a parking lot for recreational vans on the site of the bankrupt Hacienda Hotel Casino at the low-rent southern end of the Strip. Glick's look and style, he was short, balding, and owlish, belied his tenacity. Few around him knew that the youthful, studious, mild-mannered Glick, who spoke so softly that he was sometimes barely audible, had spent 2 years hanging out of a Huey helicopter in Vietnam, where he won a Bronze Star.
At the time of the Hacienda deal, I personally had $21,000 to my name, but with smoke and mirrors and my partner helping us inflate the value of everything our little development corporation owned, we were able to raise the $3 million from the First American Bank of Tennessee, where we had been doing business before and had friends. I had to get a Nevada Gaming Commission license as the owner of a Las Vegas casino, and there I was, at 29 or 30, chairman of a Las Vegas casino. Within a day, everyone in town had a deal for me. Then came the Recreon deal. My accountants had gone through the numbers and realized that you could borrow whatever you needed to buy the Stardust and the Fremont and still have money left over to cover your costs. It was the deal of a lifetime. I began putting together lists of possible investors. I called Al Barron, the assets manager for the Central States Teamster Pension Fund, because the Teamsters held the mortgages on the Stardust and Fremont. Plus, I knew they had liked the government office development I had brought them. I thought they might want to get involved in the package. The next day I flew to Chicago to the pension fund office. Al Barron took me on a tour of the building and introduced me to Frank Rainey, who was coming back from lunch with Frank Ballistrieri. Barron told me that Rainey was the Teamster trustee from Milwaukee and a member of the 3-man executive committee that oversaw all loans west of the Mississippi, which meant Las Vegas. Barron said that Ballistrieri could be my link to Frank Rainey. Ballistrieri was a very quiet, very dapper man. He said he would be happy to help, and the next time he was in Las Vegas, we would meet. The next time I met Ballistrieri, he came into the hacienda. We discussed the loan and the application package, and he said he would help me. He told me that after I submitted the loan package in Chicago, I should drive over to Milwaukee, where I could meet his sons. I didn't exactly know how or where Ballistrieri fit in, but the things I didn't want to think about, I didn't want to think about. And Barron said that Ballistrieri was my primary link to Frank Rainey, the trustee and member of the executive committee pushing my loan. After I submitted the package, I went to Milwaukee, where I met his two sons, John and Joseph. They were both attorneys. Ballistrieri said that he would like his sons involved in the operation in some way. He said Joseph had helped him run dinner theaters and was very knowledgeable about entertainment, and might serve that kind of function at the Stardust. I didn't commit myself. I said we could always discuss it once I closed the deal on the place. When I got home, I called Jerry Soloway. He's an attorney with Jenner & Block, a firm I had used. I asked him to check on a guy named Frank Ballistrieri. Soloway went crazy. He said I couldn't be seen with Ballistrieri. He said Frank Ballistrieri was identified by the FBI as the mafia boss of Milwaukee. He said my gaming license could be jeopardized with my just being seen talking to such a notorious organized crime figure. I told Jerry he had to be wrong. I had met Ballistrieri in the Teamster Pension Fund offices. He had just come back from lunch with Frank Rainey, one of the pension fund trustees. He said he didn't care where I met Ballistrieri. The man was the organized crime boss of Milwaukee. I didn't feel there was anything I could do. What was I going to tell him? I know you're the head of the mafia in Milwaukee, so don't help me get the loan? I was now very, very wary, but I felt I could maneuver it. A week or so later, the loan went through. It got a full board approval. The board's discussion of my loan took no more than 2 minutes. At the end, Bill Presser, the Teamster boss from Chicago, who had been the most reluctant of the trustees, said good luck. And that was that. I had gotten the $62.7 million Teamster loan. I was euphoric. Joe Ballistrieri called and said his father was coming into Chicago and wanted to have a celebration dinner. I said I didn't think it would be a good idea. But Joe insisted. He said, "You can't tell my father no." I didn't even want to be seen in an out-of-the-way restaurant with him, but we wound up in the pump room at the Ambassador Hotel in Chicago. He was well known in the place. Waiters, captains, they all came over. He was ordering Dom Perignon. All through dinner, I'm thinking, if the FBI was tailing him tonight, my life in Las Vegas is over. Toward the end of dinner, he said if I had any questions concerning the loan, especially the additional $65 million for renovations and expansion, I should talk to him, and only to him. I shouldn't try and discuss anything about what we had done with other trustees or union officials. He said the two of us had established a successful pattern. That's the pattern that should remain established. Then, as we were leaving, Frank said to me, "You've got to do me a favor, Alan. There's a guy living in Las Vegas. He's working for you now. It would be helpful if you give him more recognition. He can help you. His name is Frank Rosenthal. If you don't like him, you can call me up and I'll straighten him out." He said there were people on the fund who would look very favorably on the rest of my loan application if I were to promote Rosenthal. When I hesitated just a little, I could hear the tone of his voice change. He sounded annoyed. After I agreed, he asked me to meet with Rosenthal as soon as I could. I phoned Rosenthal right after I talked with Ballistrieri. He said that he was expecting the call. He asked me to acknowledge his promotion through a memo and asked me for a raise. I gave him the memo and the raise. The next day, I checked with the chairman of the Gaming Commission. I learned that Rosenthal was a genius with numbers, a master handicapper. He knew all the casino games. I also learned that he would probably never get a license. Almost all of the casino executives viewed Frank as the man with all the authority. He was supposed to clear everything with me, but he didn't. At the outset, when I questioned him about these things, he wasn't disrespectful, but every day I would hear that he had taken a little more power. I heard that when Frank walked through the casino, dealers used to jump to attention. He would fire a dealer for not standing with his hands folded before him, even at an empty table. He hired whoever he wished. He changed certain purveyors. Without clearing it, he changed the car rental company, the advertising company, and he tried to bring in his own ticketing agency for the Lido show. When these things were brought to my attention, I would either stop them or rescind them. But he was hard to stay ahead of. While I was unraveling one thing he did, he'd be in the kitchen telling the chefs how to cook. Finally, in October 1974, I called him into my office. I had just arrived from California. It was a Monday. Again, I'd learned that certain things had gone on in the casinos over that weekend, and I felt that this was the time to terminate his position. I said, "Let's go to the back of the coffee shop. I want to explain a couple of things to you." I told him what I had told him on repeated occasions, that he had to control his activities. I said that on repeated occasions he had lied to me, that there was subterfuge, and I learned that he had even instructed my secretary to tell him on a daily basis what my movements were, where I was going, and what I was going to do. I said I found that to be intolerable. He looked surprised. He asked if my secretary had told me that. I said yes. And instead of apologizing for spying on me, he said that he was going to fire her. That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with a normal man. He hesitated for a second, and then he got up, and he walked away from the table. Then he came back to the table. I could see his blood pressure rising. He said, "I think it is about time that we have a discussion, Glick." He referred to me by my last name. He had always called me Alan, but he called me by my last name as if setting the stage. He said, "It is about time you become informed of what is going on here, and where I am coming from, and where you should be. I was placed in this position not for your benefit, but for the benefit of others, and I have been instructed not to tolerate any nonsense from you, nor do I have to listen to what you say, because you are not my boss." I began to argue with him, and he said, "Let me just cut you off right here." He said, "When I say you don't have a choice, I am not just talking of an administrative basis, but I am talking about one involving health. If you interfere with any of the casino operations or try to undermine anything I want to do here, I represent to you that you will never leave this corporation alive." I felt like someone had just arrived from an alien planet. I was a businessman, and everything I had conducted was in a business-like manner, and this was almost totally a different subculture. I didn't know what to make of it. In respect to the conversation that I had had with Jerry Soloway in regard to Frank Ballistrieri, I realized that I had just entered into a trap. I told him I wanted out of the hotel. He said, "I hear what you are saying, but I want you to listen to me carefully again. When I said you will not leave this corporation alive, I meant the people that I represent have the power to do that, and much more. You should take me very serious. You are an intelligent individual, but don't test me." After I recovered, I was in somewhat of a state of shock. I called Frank Ballistrieri, and I said, "You got me into something I did not bargain for, or I would not have accepted anything like this." I said, "I felt that the appointment of your sons as corporate counsel was done in a business-like manner, and I have no problems with that. But I do have problems with this." Within a few days, Ballistrieri called back. He explained to me on the phone that he understood the situation, but at this time there was nothing he could do about it, and that I should heed Mr. Rosenthal's advice and keep him in that position.
For several months, Glick fenced with Rosenthal. He was afraid to confront him, so he tried to limit his activities. He excluded him from meetings. He tried to keep him out of the loop. He countermanded his orders. He rejected his suggestions. And finally, one night in March 1975, Alan Glick's wildest nightmare came true. He was having dinner in the Palace Court restaurant in the Stardust when Rosenthal called.
Frank said there was an emergency. I had to join him in a meeting. I asked, "What emergency?" He said he couldn't tell me over the phone, but I had to meet him. I said I'd rather not. I said we could deal with whatever it was in the morning. Then he said, "It's an emergency and you don't have a choice." I said, "Okay, where is it?" He said, "Kansas City." I thought that was ridiculous. I told him I couldn't get there before 3 or 4 in the morning. He said, "We are going to come and get you, or you are going to come voluntarily." The corporation had a couple of Lears at the time, and by 2:30 or 3 in the morning, I landed in Kansas City. Rosenthal was waiting for me with a car at the airport and introduced me to the driver, Carl DeLuna. a really gruff, vulgar man. Rosenthal referred to him by his nickname Tuffy. We then took a circuitous route to wherever we were going because I noticed that we were passing the same places time and again. Took about 20 minutes. Round and around, and no one is saying anything. Finally, we got to a hotel. The suite was pretty dark. As I walked in, I was introduced to a white-haired older man named Nick Savella. I had no idea who Nick Savella was. He turned out to be the mafia boss of Kansas City. I put out my hand to shake, and he says, "I don't want to shake your hand." There was a chair and an end table with a light on it. He told me to sit down. I saw Rosenthal leave the room. I was in there with DeLuna and Savella, except I could hear people moving in and out of the room through the interconnecting door of the suite, but that was to my back. Savilla called me every name under the sun, and then he says, "You don't know me, but if it was my choice, you'd never leave this room alive. However, due to the circumstances, if you listen, you may." When I said the light was bothering my eyes, he said he could accommodate me by pulling my eyes out. Then he said, "You reneged on our deal. You owe us $1.2 million, and you're going to let Lefty do what he wants." I was amazed. I said I didn't know what he was talking about. I meant it. He looks at me and says, laying a gun on the table, "You're going to start telling me the truth right now, or you're not leaving this room alive." He asked about my agreement with Ballistrieri, and when I said I didn't have an agreement with Ballistrieri, he said, "What?" kind of surprised. And he said he wanted to know about the agreement he had been told I had with Ballistrieri. I said the only agreement I had with Ballistrieri was about hiring his sons. Later I found out that Savella thought Ballistrieri had been given a $1.2 million cash commission for getting me the loan. Since Savella felt he had also helped me get the loan through his trustee, Roy Williams, the Teamster boss of Kansas City and the next president of the entire union, he too was entitled to $1.2 million. Ballistrieri had told me never to talk to anyone else about our arrangement, but I felt under these circumstances I had no choice. I also began to see why Ballistrieri insisted I never talk to anyone else. Savella was a tough guy, but a smart man. When he asked me questions, I could see that he was putting things together. All of a sudden, something rang a bell, and he got up. He said I still had a commitment to him and he wanted the money paid. When I said I didn't know how the corporation could pay him this money, he said, "Let Lefty handle that." When I met Rosenthal the next morning, I told him that I could not accept Savella's conditions about paying him money and having partners, and Rosenthal said that I was really no longer in a position of authority. He said I could no longer determine my destiny. When I told Ballistrieri about my meeting with Savella and told him about the threat to cut off our additional loans, Ballistrieri said there was nothing he could any longer do to help me. He said the pension fund matters were now out of his hands.
Alan Glick was now the second largest casino owner in Las Vegas. Frank Rosenthal was the town's most important gambling executive, no matter what his job title. But life in Glick's company, the Argent Corporation, was far from peaceful. Instead of being lionized by the press, Glick was ridiculed as a conduit for Teamster money. Instead of being saluted for his innovative casino management, Rosenthal was constantly diverted by problems over his licensing. The only thing that was working well was the skim, and for a long time, for the mob bosses back home, that was all that mattered. For years, skim money had been coming from the Stardust and Fremont casinos. The reason the mob needed a straight-arrow naif like Alan Glick in place was to keep the money coming. The practice of skimming, the illegal siphoning off of casino cash that is not reported as tax or as corporate income, is probably as old as the first casino count. In the late 40s and 50s, after Bugsy Siegel opened the Flamingo, the skim was used to secretly repay the original mob boss investors who wanted their dividends in cash to avoid FBI and IRS problems. There are dozens of ways to skim a casino, and most of them were in place long before Glick and Rosenthal took over. There were ticket skims, food and beverage kickbacks, theft from the count room. But amazingly, the slot machines had been largely untouched because of a serious logistical problem: the difficulty of hauling coins. $1 million in quarters, for instance, weighs 21 tons. But as slot machines were becoming a larger and larger part of the casino gross, there had to be a way to get at that money. So George J. Vandermark was hired to run the slot machines at the Argent. Vandermark was perfectly qualified for the job. He was known as the greatest slot cheat who had ever lived. Vandermark was so well known as a cross-roader and slot machine cheat that he was listed in Bob Griffin's Black Book, a who's who of casino cheats used primarily by casinos. In fact, when one of the Fremont casino executives first saw Vandermark walk into the casino, he attempted to have Vandermark thrown out. He reversed himself when he was told that Vandermark was his new boss. One of the things Vandermark did after taking over at Argent was to eliminate the controls that safeguarded the proper reporting of all cash pouring into the casino count room. He centralized slot supervision for all 4 Argent casinos and had the coins hauled from the Fremont, Hacienda, and Marina to the Stardust, where they were counted daily. Vandermark also cut down on the number of auditors who were supposed to double-check that the wrapped and stacked coins corresponded in weight and value to the number of loose coins that had originally entered the count room. Among the innovations Vandermark brought to the Stardust was to rig the slot machine meters to falsely record 1/3 more in wins than were actually being paid out. It was a brilliant stroke, because when the slot machines were emptied and the coins taken to the count room, the electronic scale used to weigh the coins had been rewired to underweigh the coins by 1/3. Vandermark now had 1/3 of the entire slot machine coin count available to skim, since the slot machines had been rigged to indicate that players had taken that amount home with them as wins. But there was a problem: how to remove tons and tons of coins from the tightly guarded count room, let alone the casino. But Vandermark had a solution. He created auxiliary banks on the floor of the casino, where the skim coins were exchanged for paper money by slot machine change clerks. The auxiliary banks circumvented normal casino procedure. The paper bills were never taken to the cashier's cage to be counted in with the rest of the casino's paper money. Vandermark had small metal doors built into the side of the auxiliary banks, so that after the clerk had slid the bills into a locked compartment inside the bank, Vandermark's men could open the door from the outside and take the bills away in large manila envelopes. The manila envelopes from the auxiliary banks in each of the Argent casinos were then taken to Vandermark's office. Then the money was handed over to special couriers who made regular trips transporting the cash between Vegas and Chicago, where it was distributed to the bosses in on the skim. The Argent skim was blatant. No one was sneaked around in the middle of the night with cash hidden under his shirt. People who worked in the count room and cashier's cage knew all about it. On one occasion, after the electronic scales were rewired, the switches were installed in back so that, by flipping them, the scale would underweigh the coin count by either 30% or 70%. During a particularly hectic day, one of Vandermark's guys flipped the wrong switch, and suddenly the scale was underweighing the coin count by 70%. Vandermark suddenly noticed how low the final count had become and realized what had happened. He screamed, "You dumb son of a bitch! You're going to get us all in trouble. We can't steal that much." The more experienced casino executives who suspected that some kind of skim was in place were experienced enough to understand that it was not in their interests to pursue such matters. They well knew that even an unintended implied threat to security of the skim could be fatal. It is estimated that Vandermark managed to skim between $7 and $15 million out of Argent between 1974 and 1976, a sum that does not include what was skimmed from the Stardust's race and sports book, credit department, or food and beverage accounts. There was no department under the control of the corporation's financial reserves that wasn't infiltrated by associates of the bosses back home. For the men who arranged the loans, the casino skim was the equivalent of striking oil. The money came pouring out every month. In Glick's first year of operation, between August of 1974 and August of 1975, Argent reported a net loss of $7.5 million. This was startling news to Glick, since the corporation's total revenue was up $3.4 million to $82.6 million during the same period. Glick was so out of the loop that he attributed the Argent casino losses to additional interest payments that hadn't been anticipated, higher depreciation and amortization costs, advances to subsidiaries, and even increased operating costs and expenses. He didn't have a clue about what they were doing or how they were doing it. In June 1975, an article about Alan Glick appeared in Business Week, and it was the nail in the coffin. Lefty was quoted as saying that Glick is the financial end, but policy comes from my office. No one could believe it. The Gaming Commission had tried for months to catch Lefty running the Stardust, and he had repeatedly insisted that he was simply the executive assistant or the public relations person or the food and beverage chieftain. Whenever an investigator showed up, Rosenthal would vanish from the casino. Now here was proof in black and white. Rosenthal made policy. If he made policy, the consequences were clear. He would have to apply for a gaming license. Naturally, Lefty claimed he was misquoted. No one believed him. The Gaming Control Board license hearings took place on the second floor of the State Office Building in Carson City. Lefty was asked about everything, about his Florida arrests, about his alleged bribery, about his relationship with Tony Spilatro. Rosenthal defended himself for 5 hours. Alan Glick testified, too, and he admitted that he hadn't known all of the details about Rosenthal's background when he hired him. But, he said, he had been pleased with Rosenthal's work and would make the same decision today. During the second day of questioning, according to Jeff Silver, the Control Board's chief counsel, it was apparent that Lefty did not have enough answers for the questions they were asking. On January 15, 1976, after 2 days of hearings, the Control Board made its recommendation to deny Lefty his license. The Commission's refusal to license him was supposed to be the end of Lefty Rosenthal at the Stardust. Lefty was to be out of gaming. No more masquerades behind different job descriptions like Public Relations Director or Food and Beverage Director. He was given 48 hours to clear out his desk, and he did. On January 29, 1976, Lefty moved out of his newly refurbished office at the Stardust and went home. The next day, Control Board investigators learned that his $2.5 million 10-year contract was still in effect. Lefty Rosenthal had no intention of either quitting or giving up. He established a war room at home and embarked on a dual campaign. First, to continue to exert as much influence as he could over the casinos, and second, to start a series of legal battles with state gaming authorities to challenge the power of the state to even issue gaming licenses. These highly publicized and increasingly bitter court cases went on for years. They seemed to take on a life of their own. From local courts to state appeals courts, to U.S. district courts, to U.S. appeals courts, and all the way up to the Supreme Court, Lefty led a parade of legal maneuverings. He won some, he lost some. When he won, he moved back into his offices at the Stardust. When he lost, he moved out. Dennis Gomes, the 26-year-old chief auditor for the Control Board, had learned from informants who worked at the Stardust that there was something going on with the slot count. Gomes had always been curious why Argent would have ever hired anyone as notorious as Jay Vandermark to run the slot machine operations. It was not unusual for casinos to hire crossroaders, card mechanics, and dice cheats. What better way was there to catch a crossroader than to use other crossroaders familiar with the routines? But it was very unusual, perhaps even foolhardy, to put a world-class crossroader like Jay Vandermark in a position of fiduciary responsibility. Gomes was certain Argent's slot operation was being skimmed, but he needed help. He did not even have an investigative auditor who could use the casino's own figures to unmask fraud or worse. The control board had never bothered to fill that position. Gomes decided to change all that, and he put an ad in the California Law Journal. Dick Law, a bored 28-year-old CPA and non-practicing attorney, answered the ad. Law, who had been a philosophy major in college, thought the job would be a challenge. He was hired. Law and Gomes began digging into the Argent slot machine books and compiling and cross-referencing the data and the lists of people and jobs with the names of organized crime figures. Everything they found led to something else. Then, Gomes began monitoring the auxiliary banks that dotted the Stardust casino floor and comparing the number of plays shown on the machines with the total listed by the Argent auditors. Huge discrepancies began to emerge. Clearly, the only purpose for such banks was to circumvent sending the slot machine cash into the count room and cashier's cage, where it could come under the scrutiny of people not in on the skim. Gomes and Law became even more suspicious when they discovered that Argent's other casinos, the Fremont and Hacienda, sent their slot revenue to the Stardust for tabulation, despite the fact that they had their own count rooms. On May 18, 1976, Gomes, Law, and 2 Gaming Control Board agents walked into the Stardust cashier's cage and demanded to see the books. The cage employees were stunned. Gomes and Law had informants inside who had told them there was a special fund set up and that slot money was being siphoned out of the casino. When they went in, they asked for the special fund. The shift boss turned white and said he didn't know anything about any special fund. He called the slot manager at home. The slot manager said he didn't know anything about a special fund either. Gomes got on the phone and said he didn't care what it was called. He wanted to see where the money that wasn't kept in the coin room was kept. They finally got to 2 steel cabinets behind the change booth. Gomes asked for a key, and they finally found one, but it only opened one side. It was filled with coins. Somehow nobody could find the key for the other side. So Gomes and Law drilled it open, and inside they found stack upon stack of $100 bills. And when they checked, they found that the coins were nowhere to be found in the general ledgers. It was all skim, and it was being held there until the change girls converted it to paper at the auxiliary banks. The raid of the Stardust uncovered the biggest slot skim in the history of Las Vegas and sent the hotel into complete chaos. Glick at first called the charges of skimming nonsense, and then charged that he was the victim of embezzlement by ex-employees. The Gaming Control Board agreed. The word embezzlement, rather than skim, was worth millions of dollars to Alan Glick. The casino's license would have been revoked if the Control Board had decided that Argent's management had participated in the skim. The Control Board did issue a subpoena for Vandermark, even though there wasn't the remotest possibility that a man who had fled under an assumed name and was hiding somewhere in Mexico was likely to turn up. On December 2nd, 1976, one of Lefty Rosenthal's greatest long shots came in. Las Vegas District Court Judge Joseph Pawlikowski ordered Argent to rehire Rosenthal. After 3 days of hearings, Pawlikowski ruled that Lefty should be reinstated because he had not been granted his full rights at the Gaming Commission hearings. Lefty, the old handicapper, did not mention to the press that Judge Pawlikowski was the man who had married him and Jerry at Caesar's Palace back in 1969, or that when Pawlikowski's daughter was married in one of the Stardust's main ballrooms a few years later, the wedding was partially comped. According to the Las Vegas Sun, Pawlikowski denied any inference of wrongdoing. Lefty Rosenthal was back. He was back like a barnacle. On February 4th, 1977, only 2 months after Rosenthal walked in and reclaimed his office, the Nevada Supreme Court reversed Pawlikowski's ruling, but Lefty stayed put. The court ruled that there were no constitutionally protected rights in cases involving gambling licenses, and that gambling does not carry the same rights as other occupations. It went on to say that if Rosenthal wanted to remain in his gaming post, he would have to apply for licensing as a key employee. Rosenthal was prepared. He resigned as head of the casino and was immediately appointed by Glick as Argent's food and beverage director. The post paid $5,000 less than the $40,000 a year salary the Gaming Commission considered the minimum for key employees. Rosenthal then embarked on an all-out campaign to get a license. What had started out over a year earlier as a simple suit over Rosenthal's right to a gaming permit escalated into a full-scale war between Lefty and the state's politically powerful licensing czars. Rosenthal was no longer just bothersome and litigious. He was dangerous. He was all over the place. Like many men who come noisily to public life, like Donald Trump and George Steinbrenner, to take two other examples, he began to crave the spotlight. Eventually, Rosenthal and his lawyer accumulated over 3,000 pages of hearings, as well as charts, visual aids, and 2 pamphlets, Gaming Agency's efforts to deprive Frank Rosenthal of livelihood, and the biographical Lifetime of Betting and Being an Odds Maker and Handicapper. One judge, who was asked to read all 6 volumes of hearings before handing down a ruling, refused absolutely to do so. "I can't read this any more than I can read 3 Sears catalogs and the Old and New Testaments," said Judge Carl Christensen. Just in case the charges arose that Rosenthal's title of food and beverage director was just a cover for what he was really up to, running the casino as usual, Lefty threw himself into his new job description. He announced that he would be the host of a talk show that would promote the Stardust and, of course, its food and beverages, and he began to write a column for the Las Vegas Sun. The Frank Rosenthal Show began in April 1977 and appeared erratically thereafter at 11 p.m. on Saturday night for 2 years. As a rule, the show contained a series of plugs for various Argent hotels, nightclubs, and performers from the Lido show. Interviews with handicappers Joey Boston and Marty Kane on that week's upcoming games, drop-ins by near greats like Jill St. John and O.J. Simpson, and the occasional appearance of a genuine superstar like Frank Sinatra. Rosenthal introduced everyone in the vernacular made famous by that equally unlikely host, Ed Sullivan. The women were very lovely, the bands were very, very fine, the dancers were not just very, very fine, but highly trained and very flexible, very pretty, very long-legged. The performers at the Stardust were very, very talented. The show was amateurish and self-serving, but it had a strange, addictive quality, and before long, it was the top-rated local show when it was on. Tony Spilotro was finding Lefty's celebrity hard to take. He had to watch him on television. He had to watch him walk into the Jubilation nightclub trailing a chorus line of showgirls, lawyers, and bookmakers all kissing his ass. According to Frank Collada, Tony was beginning to feel that Lefty was getting way out of control.
Tony resented Lefty because Tony felt he was the real boss in Las Vegas. And there was Lefty walking all over the place, taking bows as though he was the big man in town. He said Lefty was getting so nuts that the other night when he was having some drinks, Tony's friend Joey Cusimano was at Lefty's table, and Lefty said, "I'm the biggest Jew in America." Joey answered him, "Oh yeah, Frank? I didn't know Lansky was dead." Tony loved that story. He told it to everybody, that Joey slapped Lefty right back in his place.
The Las Vegas FBI had been on Spilotro's case for years and had built up a considerable dossier on him and his crew. The information was assembled in order to prove that Spilotro was what the newspapers always said he was, the mob's main man in Las Vegas and the true power behind the Stardust Hotel. But almost none of the information picked up on the FBI bug seemed to confirm Spilotro's reputation. Spilotro and his crew of bookmakers, shakedown artists, loan sharks, and burglars were exactly that. Bookmakers, shakedown artists, loan sharks, and burglars. They did not seem to operate anywhere near the top of the casino business. In fact, they were lucky to get the minor assignments handed them by the bosses back home accomplished. Typical activities picked up on FBI telephone taps and rune bugs between April 13th and May 13th, 1978 dealt with the mundane and tedious details of getting people jobs and comps.
Whenever the papers mention Tony, they always mention Frank Rosenthal in the next paragraph, no matter how many times I told them that even though I had a long personal relationship with Spilatro, I had no business dealings with him. The media always linked us together. There was no help. In fact, I'm certain I would not have had the kinds of licensing problems I had except for being linked all the time with Tony. The truth is, and I know this for sure, Tony was as light as a feather in the outfit. The public perception was the opposite of the facts. But he began to believe his own PR. One night I met him on a desert road way out. He had a plan. He wanted to take over the Midwest. He starts talking about the guys he has to kill. I'm thinking, who am I dealing with here? He says, we're dealing with $1 billion enterprise here. He's talking to a lifelong friend, an advisor, someone who knew all the players, and he's asking me what do I think. And all the while, he's giving me the names of who has to be whacked. My heart is pounding. I slowed him down. I said, Tony, let's say you're successful, and I don't think the chances are 50-50. What do you think will happen in Kansas City, Milwaukee, Detroit, New York? He jumps right in and says that I'm talking about places east of the Mississippi. We're not part of that. Let's stick to the Midwest. He's arguing geography. The truth is, the east of the Mississippi crews don't have anything to do with the Midwest and the West, but murdering several family bosses might change a little of that for a while. No. Tony only wants to discuss it in terms of Midwest crews. Okay, I say, do you think the other groups are not going to be aware that there's a mad crew in Chicago who took over without permission? You'll be considered the most dangerous crew in the world. Also, if you knock out the top bosses of Chicago, what makes you think their underlings are going to fall into line? But he had dreams. He would become the pope of the mob, and I would become Lansky. That's the way he was talking out there in the desert. He got very angry. It looks like every time I come up with a proposition that needs your support, you give me the X, he said. Maybe I do, I said. So don't ask me for my support. I could see that he had come to hate me. Just standing there in the desert, pissing on his parade, he had turned from me as a friend. I had turned him down once too many times.
Sometimes they called him Genius, and sometimes they called him Baldy. Whatever he was, Alan Glick was a mistake, and the mob wanted him out. In the beginning, Glick had looked like the perfect mark, but he was turning out to be much more trouble than he was worth. For one thing, he was too attractive a target. The press loved to kick him, to poke fun at his inexperience, to mock his seriousness, to imply that there was something suspicious about his stewardship. For another thing, he was considerably more clever than anyone at the Teamsters Pension Fund had expected. In 1976, as part of a routine investigation of Glick's petition to raise additional funds to repay his debenture holders, the American Stock Exchange discovered that Glick had lent $10 million in Argent money to some of his private corporate subsidiaries with no schedule to pay the money back. Then, in 1977, the Securities and Exchange Commission disclosed that within a week of receiving the Teamster loan back in 1974, Glick had taken $317,500 from it and used it to remodel his home and pay off personal debts. The SEC charged Glick with using Argent as his private source of funds in flagrant disregard of his fiduciary duty to Argent's debenture holders. Glick's problems were heightened by the fact that the Teamster empire was collapsing. He was a footnote in that collapse, but a highly entertaining one. Glick's ongoing hubris was just begging for comeuppance. One of the people who read a Wall Street Journal article on Glick's loans to himself was Nick Savella, the Kansas City crime chief whom Glick had flown to meet 4 years earlier in the room with the lone light bulb. Savella was furious that Glick had his hand in the till. It was hard enough stealing from a casino without having the casino owner ahead of you in line. Savella would have called Glick himself to say so, but for one inconvenience. He was in jail, serving a short stint for making illegal bets on an interstate phone. his phone calls were monitored. But during a family prison visit with his brother Carl Corky Savella, Savella passed the word that something had to be done about Glick. So Carl Savella and his top lieutenant, Carl Tuffy DeLuna, began a series of trips to Chicago to meet with the other mobsters who were partners in Argent with the Kansas City group. The plan was either to force Glick out or to force him to buy out the mob for millions of dollars in cash. The point man on this plan was Tuffy DeLuna. DeLuna was an armed robber and hitman, but he had the soul of a bookkeeper. He kept meticulous notes of his travels and itemized all his expenses on 3x5 index cards and in notebooks. The names of the people were in code, but they were easily decipherable. Alan Glick was called Genius, Lefty Rosenthal was called Crazy, and Joe Agosto of the Tropicana was Caesar. In late April of 1978, Carl DeLuna flew to Las Vegas and had a meeting that was the final chapter in the education of Alan Glick, as Glick later testified.
Mr. DeLuna, in a gruff voice, using graphic terms, told me to sit down. With that, he pulled out a piece of paper from his pocket. Out of his vest pocket. He was wearing a three-piece suit, I believe, and he looked down at the paper for a few seconds. Then he looked up at me, and he informed me he was sent there to deliver one last final message to me from his partners. And he began reading the paper. He said that he and his partners were finally sick of having to deal with me and having me around, and that I could no longer be tolerated. He wanted me to know that everything he said would be the last time I would hear it from him or anyone else, because there would be no other opportunity for me to hear it unless I abided by what he said. He informed me that it was their desire to have me sell the Argent Corporation immediately, and that I was to announce that sale as soon as I left the meeting. He said that he realized the threats that I received perhaps may not have been taken by me to be as serious as they were given to me. And he says that since I perhaps find my life expendable, he was certain I wouldn't find my children's life expendable. With that, he looked down on his piece of paper, and he gave me the names and ages of each one of my sons. And he said that if he did not hear within a short period of time that I announced the sale, that one by one he would have each one of my sons murdered. With that he continued on with his general demeanor, which was vulgar and animalistic, and the meeting ended with me saying that I was willing to sell, which I was before that meeting, and that I would do it.
On November 28, 1978, Carl Thomas and Joe Agosto arrived in Kansas City for a meeting with Nick Savella. Thomas had recently been put in charge of the skim at the Tropicana Hotel, and now there was a problem. Savella believed that he was being skimmed by the very people Carl Thomas had put in charge. The skimmers were skimming the skim. This, of course, was a problem as old as the skim itself. Agosto and Thomas met to discuss the Tropicana skim with Savella, his brother Carl, and Carl DeLuna at the home of Carl Savella's sister-in-law, Josephine Marlowe. Marlowe's house was around the corner from Savella's in an Italian neighborhood, and it had one big advantage. It was possible to drive into the garage, close the garage door, and enter the house from the garage, thus evading the eyes of neighbors and whoever else might be watching. But the FBI knew that Savella used Marlowe's home for meetings and had managed to get authorization to put a tap into the basement dining room. No one had a clue. The meeting began at 10 a.m. and ended at 6 p.m., and when it was over, there were 8 reels of tape that became a landmark in law enforcement. The Savella brothers, DeLuna, Agosto, and Thomas ate spaghetti, drank wine, and laid out a primer on how to skim a casino. The Marlowe tape was an extraordinary document, illuminating, hilarious, breathtakingly candid. It was ultimately responsible for the end of the role of the mob in Las Vegas. On it, Carl Thomas described how the skim operated at the Tropicana and how it had worked at Argent. He took the Kansas City crew through the advantages and disadvantages of various forms of skimming, from Thomas' favorite method, just stealing the cash, to his least favorite, filling out slips and triplicate and then removing the money. He talked about short-weighing coins and auxiliary banks. He described the method he used at Slots of Fun, the small casino he operated on the Strip, and explained why it wouldn't work in a larger casino. He spoke philosophically about how the men you trust to steal for you are bound to steal something for themselves. "Gentlemen, these are the hazards of doing business," Carl Thomas said at one point in the meeting. "Sometimes people are going to steal even from you." Carl Thomas talked and talked and talked. As he said years later, after being sentenced to a 15-year prison term as a direct result of that afternoon, I must have been out of my mind. Less than 3 months after the Marlowe meeting, FBI and police agents knocked on Carl DeLuna's door and presented him with a search warrant allowing them to look for records and papers. In a locked room in the basement, agents found notebooks, steno pads, hotel notepads, index cards, all of them covered with neatly written notes in red or black ink, dated and neatly itemizing all of DeLuna's expenses. The messages are in code, but the code was easily deciphered once it was matched to surveillance and wiretapped conversations. The notes showed the breakdown and distribution of the skim to 22, or Joe Iupa of Chicago, to Deer Hunter, or Mace Rockman of Cleveland, to Berman, or Frank Bellestrieri of Milwaukee, to On, or Nick Savella of Kansas City. DeLuna was eventually sentenced to 30 years in prison. His arrest and the recovery of his notes provided the FBI with a blueprint for the skim conspiracy. In fact, it would probably not be an exaggeration to say that the Marlowe meeting and Carl DeLuna's notes are responsible for knocking the mob out of Las Vegas casinos.
Jerry took the kids on a vacation to La Costa. When she left, we weren't getting along too well. On the second day, she was drunk, couldn't get on the phone. I didn't talk to her for the next 2 days. Then just before they were supposed to come home, I still hadn't heard from them. So I checked the hotel and was told that they had moved out 2 days ago. I really began to panic. I couldn't even find them on any of the airline manifests. So I called Robin's boyfriend. He's a decent kid. I told him I was looking for my wife and kids. At first he said they didn't know anything. Then he told me that Jerry and the kids were with Lenny Marmer and Robin. He gave me a phone number. So Lenny Marmer answers the phone. He sounded sharp, slick, a smooth way of talking. He had a fake, slight southern accent. I said, "Lenny, this is Frank Rosenthal. I want to talk to Jerry." He said she wasn't there. "Lenny," I said, "I want to talk to Jerry. It's very important. I want my kids. I want her to put them on a plane, quick." He said very sincerely, "Frank, believe me, I don't know where she is, but can I call you back in a few minutes?" "Fine," I say, and I hang up. That was it. They all hit the road. Jerry, Robin, my kids, and Mama. That night, Jerry calls Spalatro. He calls me right away and says she's worried that I was going to have them traced and killed. He told her, "I can't help you. Just send the kids back now. Frank's in a panic." But she calls, "Hi, hi." I told her I wasn't going to ask where she was. Just put Stephen and Stephanie on a plane as quickly as she could. Then call me back, give me their arrival time, then you can do what you want to do. Jerry then asks, "If I were to come back, would you forgive me?" I told her I didn't know. I said I'd try. I know I still cared for her, but I said, "Right now, you've got to send me the kids." She hung up and talked to Lenny and Robin. And what does Lenny say? Jerry later told me. He tells her to get the money out of a safe deposit box I had in Los Angeles, dye her hair, and take off with him and the kids for Europe. Jerry told Lenny no, because she knew me and said that I'd hunt them down until I found them. She called me back and said she was sending the kids. She called later with their flight number. The housekeeper and I went to the airport. We got the 2 kids. A little while later, Jerry calls. She's feeling me out. I said to her, "You didn't go to the box, did you?" She didn't answer me. I said, "Jerry, what happened to the money?" She said she made a mistake. "How serious a mistake?" I asked. "Serious," she said. "Remember, there's over $2 million cash in that box." "What's it under?" I asked. 25, she says. $25,000? Yeah, she says. She bought him some clothes, a new watch, junk, real pimp stuff. I said, don't worry about it. It's no big deal. I'll have a Lear out there in a couple of hours to pick you up. Just hold that key. Don't let Lenny near the key. If he gets the key, he'll be able to open the box. You've lost $25,000 to that pimp, I said. I can handle that. I can't handle any more. Jerry said when she told Robin she was coming back to me, Robin said she felt like she had no mother. Robin's loyalty had always been to Lenny Marmer, her natural father. Lenny had never married Jerry. He'd gotten married 3 times, but he never married Jerry, the mother of his daughter. Still, Jerry was as loyal to him as she could be to anyone. It was unreal. In a few hours, I got a call from the pilot, who gives me the time he expects to land, and I get out to the airport, and she wobbles off the plane, got a big smile, like nothing happened. On the drive home, we're talking about the box. She said she couldn't get the safe deposit key from Robin, but there was no danger since the banks had been closed, and Robin needed Jerry's signature to get in the box. We started arguing again. When we got home, the phone was ringing. It was Spilatro. How are things, he wants to know. I tell him things are okay. Jerry says, is that Tony? Can I talk to him? I said, no. Tony says, I want to talk to her. I say no again. Tony now says, I want to talk to her. Do you hear me? He's sounding a little strong. I said no again, and I thank him for his help, and he interrupts. But I said I want to talk to her, he says. I hung up on him. Was that Tony? Jerry asked. I wanted to talk to him. I told her I wanted to talk about the money in the box. The next morning we waited for a call from Robin. I didn't answer it because I didn't want to spook anything. Robin said that Lenny had been trying to get Robin to give him her key to the box. Jerry says, I am begging you with my life, don't do it. Don't listen to your father. Jerry is crying on the phone and begging Robin. Terrific performance. Robin surrenders. She promises she won't raid the box.
The marriage of Lefty and Jerry Rosenthal was falling apart.
I remember I was watching football. Jerry knew I was preoccupied. She said, I'm going to my sister's. She said she was dropping Stephen off at some neighbors and taking Stephanie to Barbara's with her. She wanted to know if I might want some McDonald's on her way home. I said, well, maybe. She knew I liked McDonald's. She gave me Barbara's number. I didn't have a sister's number. I didn't give a fuck about a sister. So she left the number near the phone and left. About halftime, I decided to call her sister. I was going to tell her to bring me back some McDonald's. I called. Barbara said she was at McDonald's getting lunch for Stephanie. And on that day, Jerry had taken my car. It was bigger than hers. I had a mobile phone in my car, so I rang my mobile phone just in case. The phone gets picked up, but it's a man's voice, muffled, covered up. But I know the voice. I've known it all my life. It was Tony's. I knew Tony's voice no matter what. I hung right up. Uh-oh. What the hell do I have here? Just to make sure, I called the number right back, but this time I get the operator saying that the mobile number is not in service at this time. Now I'm not able to watch a football game. I got a real problem coming up. The next day I said, look, Jerry, the best thing is for me to tell it the way it is. I feel you've been with somebody. I know it. We both know it. I just hope it wasn't with 1 or 2 guys. What 2? She asked, looking me in the eye, almost a smile. Tony or Joey, I say. She just looks at me with a little smile. Jerry, I say, this is no fucking game. I'm not going to listen to any more games. You go down the line with me right now or you're out of here. I'm telling her if she bullshits me, the marriage is over. She was full of 2 and all. She told me it was Tony. She told it straight, no big deal. She said they had been half boozed when it began, and I'm listening to her, and I'm getting sick inside. I try to explain that we were all in danger. I told her if Tony suspected I knew, he might think I'd make a beef back home, and she and I would both be killed. I knew him. We'd both just disappear. She said she understood, It had been a crazy thing. She'd get us all out of this. But she needed a little time to back him off. She couldn't just stop seeing him in the morning. He'd get suspicious. I'd find out. The plan was to let it die out nice and smoothly. She filled me in on the background. She said that they had been seeing each other for 6 months to a year. I remembered when Jerry and I were dating. I remembered taking her with me to Chicago. One of my first stops was to see Tony and Nancy and his brothers. I walked into Tony's house with Jerry. She was in a classy miniskirt. I remembered he said, "Holy shit, where did you find her?" But now it was over, and I had a choice. I could go to Chicago and take a position against Tony, but I was trying to prevent a war. I felt there would be no winners. I told her that. She said she understood and that it was over and that she would break it off. I asked, what if Tony didn't want to break it off? And she said that would be no problem. She'd just back him off. If you listen to her, she was really convincing. Instead, I later found out they went right on meeting in motels or his apartment in the towers across from the club or wherever. Plus, he starts asking me all the time, is anything wrong? Is everything okay? He's poking. I know him. I told her I was thinking about a formal separation, a divorce, even without the Tony situation, which no one knew about. This thing wasn't working.
The Spilatro-Rosenthal affair was the worst-kept secret in town. In no time, everybody knew. Jerry began showing up at the beauty parlor and gym with presents that she said came from her new sponsor, which is hooker talk for boyfriend or protector. She also began telling her friends that her new sponsor was Tony Spilatro. Jerry did not keep up any pretenses. Kent Clifford, the chief of Las Vegas Metro Intelligence, observed that Spilatro openly flaunted his relationship with Jerry as a show of power. He could have had dozens of women, younger and prettier than Jerry Rosenthal, but power is an aphrodisiac. At about this time, Frank Collada took a trip back home and found himself facing a lot of questions.
I go to Chicago, and they heard about something. What the fuck's going on out there? Joey Lombardo says. What's he doing, fucking the guy's wife? I lied. I said no. I played dumb. I said I didn't know anything about that. What could I say? That Tony was fucking Lefty's wife, and that the FBI and Metro were all over everybody? We hope he's not, they said. But I can see that they are perturbed. Next, that's Joe Ferriola, sees me. What's going on with that fucking Jew, he says. He's acting crazy. The little guy wouldn't be fucking his old lady, would he? Because if he is, that's a problem. I lied again. I said no. There's nothing going on. The fucking guy's just crazy. Tony could have been called in and killed for jeopardizing everything, but by now they're sure Lefty is a psycho. Only the bosses like Joey Ayupa backed Lefty, but only because he made so much money for them.
I assumed Jerry had backed Tony off. But when I suspected she was still talking to Lenny Marmer, I had our home phone bugged. And then, after a couple of days, I heard her talking to Tony on the tapes. He'd talk very quickly. She'd tell him when I was coming home. This was after she told me she was going to back him off. After I warned her of the danger and everything. And now I'm listening to her talk to Tony with my own ears, planning where they could meet. I couldn't even look at her. I was so angry with what I heard. She was going to get us killed. The kids had a swim meet the next day and went to bed early, and that night I said, Jerry, level with me. If you never leveled with me before, tell me the truth. Are you still seeing our friend? I told her you're just as much at risk as I am. They'll kill you before they kill me or him. Don't worry, she says, it's over. Meanwhile, I know I got her on tape and she's still meeting the guy. I asked, do you have any contact at all with him? No, dear, she says. Are you sure? I say. After all we've been through, I'm surprised you could even ask, she says. Okay, Jerry, I say. Swear. I swear, Jerry says. I would never. Can't you ever let it go? Swear to me, I say. Swear to me on your son's life, and then I'll let it go. She looks right at me. She's angry. I swear on our son's life, she says. Now will you stop? You bitch, I said. I've got you recorded. And I took out the small recorder with the cassette and I pressed the play button. And she heard herself talking to Tony. Turn that off, she screamed at me. I don't want to hear any more. You bitch, I say. No, I'm really hot. I'm going to throw you out this fucking window. She starts screaming, Stephen, help, Stephen, the poor kid. Comes out, he's half asleep. He's about 9. Now Jerry had me backed off. If you don't get off me, she said, I'm calling the police. I walked out and went to the casino. I had some dinner and later went back and fell asleep. I made my priority Stephen and Stephanie's swim meet.
Lefty had already begun to divide things up. He'd filed a quitclaim agreement in court separating the properties in preparation for the dissolution of the marriage. Lefty had also gotten Jerry to agree that she would lose her right to care, custody, and control of their minor children if she engaged in alcohol and/or barbiturates. Rosenthal filed for a divorce on September 11, 1980. It was uncontested. Lefty got what he wanted, custody of the children. In return, he agreed to $5,000 a month alimony and visitation rights. Jerry kept her $1 million in jewelry and the Mercedes she drove off in. There were stories in the newspapers about Lefty and Jerry, and Tony and Jerry, and Lefty and Tony, and stories from anonymous law enforcement officials who feared a Rosenthal-Spilatro mob war. The FBI purposely exploited the publicity, but by that time Joe Ayupa had more to be upset about with Tony Spilatro than philandering. Las Vegas Metro cops would do anything to get Tony, and he would do anything to embarrass them. The anger between Kent Clifford and his Metro cops and Spilatro and his men escalated, and at one point they accused one another of shooting up one another's houses and cars. It got so bad that one day, when Clifford received information that 2 of his detectives were on a hit list, he strapped on a gun, brought along an armed sidekick, and the 2 of them flew to Chicago. He went straight to the homes of Joe Ayupa and Joey Lombardo, Spilatro's 2 immediate bosses, in order to confront them. But when Clifford and his sidekick arrived at Ayupa's house, the only person at home was the boss's 72-year-old wife. They then went over to Joey Lombardo's house, but his wife, too, was the only Lombardo at home. In later explaining his journey to Chicago to the Los Angeles Times, Clifford said he then tracked down Lombardo's attorney and went over to see him, warning the lawyer that if any of his men were harmed, he would return to the homes he just visited and kill everything that moves, walks, or crawls. Clifford said he then went to a hotel and waited until 2:30 a.m., at which time he got a call wishing him a safe trip. This, he said, was the prearranged code with Lombardo's lawyer that the alleged hit on the 2 detectives had been called off. Frank Collada recalls that it was all going bad.
You've got that nut job, Kent Clifford, knocking at Lombi and Ayupa's door. I don't want to know what Ayupa heard from his old lady when he got home that night. And on top of everything, Tony's under a lot of pressure for money, and he puts the pressure on us to earn. We were knocking over jewelry stores every other week. We ran out of places in Las Vegas. We were flying out to San Jose, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Phoenix. Usually I brought all the swag to his brother Michael in Chicago. But now even Michael got 18 months on a bookmaking case, so we were fencing this stuff all over the place. I first heard that there was over $1 million in cash and jewelry in the vault at Bertha's Jewelers on West Sahara Avenue about a year before. We knew it was a family business, and there was a safe with at least $500,000 in cash. You could see the jewelry in the place just by looking in the windows every day. Unfortunately, one of the guys in on the deal was working for the G. It was that asshole Sal Romano. We didn't know it at the time, but the feds had Sal on a drug case, and he was trying to skate by giving up Tony and us. Normally, you could pull your truck up to the side of the building and make a hole. At Bertha's, though, we figured if the vault wall was steel, not just cement, we needed torches, and that could take 45 minutes, and that's why we decided to go in through the roof. I radio Larry Newman, and I tell Larry to pick up Sal on Sahara Avenue on the other side of the street from Bertha's, so they can go up and down the street watching out together. Then I get a call from Larry saying he's driving up and down Sahara, and he can't find Sal. Sal was supposed to be standing out there at the curb waiting for Larry to pick him up. Now Larry's cursing Sal and saying he should have killed him long ago. Uh-oh, I think. Then I see radio cars coming down the street, and I say over the walkie-talkie, everybody get out of there. We had rendezvous spots for the guys inside, and I told them to get out of there, that the cops are on the way. From inside I hear them say, it's too late. The cops are coming through the roof. Finally, they bring us all in. There ain't no Sal Romano. That's when I was certain he was the rat. The feds had set us up. They were on us from the first. Sal walked the streets of Chicago for a week after that. I resented that Tony didn't kill the guy for me. I told Tony that Sal was the rat, but he just put it off. Anyway, the G had been waiting for us in a building right across the street. They had been watching us out of some windows with binoculars. We didn't stand a chance. They were going to use the Bertha's case to bring us all down, and they did. The Bertha's arrest was the beginning of the end of Tony's crew at the Gold Rush. They got us all that day, and that left Tony pretty exposed.
This was the most dangerous time. Years of surveillance and phone taps had begun to bring in the indictments. It was a time when the defendants and their lawyers would spend months poring over hours of wiretaps and bound volumes of typed transcriptions. The lawyers were looking for loopholes. The defendants were looking for potential witnesses to murder. It was a time when just being suspected of cooperating with the government was enough to get you killed. And even if you didn't cooperate and got a long stretch in prison, you could still be in danger because now you could be perceived as far more vulnerable to the government's sweet deals. About 8 months after the Bertha arrest, Charlie Parsons of the FBI paid a visit to Frank Collada.
We've got some information, he says, that your friend Tony Spilatro has a murder contract out on you. That was a Friday. I just nodded to the guy. I'm thinking about what happened a few weeks before. I was asleep. Boom, bang, boom, boom. What the fuck, I said. What the hell's all those shots? I got up real quick. I go look out the window. These guys in a van are going past. They shot the guy in the apartment next door. The guys Tony got to do the job missed. If he had me on the case, it would have been done right. But who knows where he was going for the work now that my whole crew was buried. He farms the job out and they shoot the wrong guy. They shoot the guy next door to me.
3 days later, Monday morning at 8:15 a.m., FBI agent Parsons got a phone call.
Do you recognize my voice?
Within 20 minutes, Collada was in a safe house guarded by a half-dozen agents. They began to debrief him and took him to Chicago for a hearing.
I don't know how I wound up with that transactional immunity, but I did. That's the best kind of immunity you can get. In other words, when you've got transactional immunity, you can't be tried for anything you talk about, no matter whatever it is. But the Chicago judge gave me that kind of immunity, and I didn't even know what the fuck he was doing when he gave it to me. What do I know about immunity? I walk out of court, and the FBI guy says, I think the judge made a mistake. They were shocked.
After Rosenthal was forced out of the Stardust, you could set your watch by his schedule. So could a car bomber. Alcohol tobacco agent in charge John Rice, investigating the case with Metro, said Lefty was very fortunate to have survived the blast. 99 times out of 100, a bomb like that should have killed him, Rice reported. Except in the model of Eldorado Cadillac, the manufacturer installed a steel floor plate beneath the driver's seat for added stability. It was that steel plate under the driver's seat that saved Lefty's life. It deflected the bomb upwards and toward the rear of the car instead of up and forward. The agent suggested Lefty change his name to Lucky. The explosion was big news. The newspapers and TV news shows led with it for days. There are two serious theories about who tried to bomb Frank Rosenthal. The first, which the FBI believes, is that it was Frank Balistrieri. Balistrieri was actually known as the Mad Bomber owing to his habit of blowing up his adversaries. And an FBI wiretap in Balistrieri's office a few weeks before the bombing had recorded Balistrieri telling his sons that he believed that Frank Rosenthal caused their problems. He promised his sons that he would get full satisfaction. The second theory, popular with the Metro cops, is that Spilatro did it. Jerry Rosenthal had moved to an apartment in Beverly Hills, but she flew into town to see Lefty after the bombing.
She said she wanted to take care of me, protect me. But the flame was out in me. She said, "You know I can change." She tried to give me her phone number that day, but I said I didn't need it. She could always reach me. She was running with a bad crowd, lowlifes, pimps, druggies, bikers. She had a boyfriend who was a musician. He was beating her up a lot. She was living a tough life. She came to Las Vegas for the holidays. She'd come into town. If the kids had swim meets, she'd come in for parties, the kid stuff, that sort of thing. I never looked forward to it because I never knew what she would do. At this time, Jerry was going with a younger kid. He addressed me as Mr. Rosenthal whenever we had spoken over the phone. I had already told him to behave himself. "You understand, you're dating my children's mother," I said. "Yes, sir, Mr. Rosenthal," he said at the time. Now Jerry is calling from a booth. She says she's bleeding and this kid had beaten the shit out of her. I asked, what could I do? And she says, call him, make him stop. He'll be at this number in about an hour. I take the number, and now I'm up. I sit around looking at the clock for an hour. It takes a long time for the hour to pass. Then I dial a number, and who answers? Jerry. "Hi." "What the fuck, are you nuts?" I asked her. "I thought this guy was beating you up. What are you doing there? Why did you go back?" "Oh," she says, "I'm okay." "Let me talk to the punk," I tell her. "It's okay," she says, "I can handle it." It later turned out she had this apartment and they were living there, and he threatened to break up with her, and she got hysterical and decided, in her drunkenness, to get me to threaten the kid into not leaving her.
At 4:35 a.m. on November 6, 1982, about 1 month after Lefty's car was bombed, Jerry Rosenthal began screaming on the sidewalk in front of the Beverly Sunset Motel at 8775 Sunset Boulevard and stumbled into the motel lobby where she collapsed. A motel clerk called police, but when they arrived with an ambulance, she was in a coma. She never recovered. She died 3 days later at Cedars-Sinai Hospital. She was 46.
The way I found out was I got a call from Bob Martin's wife, Charlotte. She said, "Frank, I got bad news. My furrier just called and said Robin was in the store picking up Jerry's furs. Robin said that Jerry had passed away." I called the furrier immediately. I said, "My name is Frank Rosenthal." He knew who I was, and he started thanking me for all the business I had given over the years. I said, "Listen, is Robin Mama there?" "Yes," he says. "She's here to pick up Jerry's furs. She says her mother is dead." The furrier was named Fred something. I said, "Fred, you don't give her a fucking thing. You understand me?" "Yes, sir," he says. I hung up. I called the morgue. Yes, there was a body. She was dead. I got the MD. I finally got a call 2 days later from Robin. I pretend I don't already know. I get some details from her. She's making some arrangements for the funeral. I said, "Let me get back to you." And so when I did, we had a dispute over where Jerry would be buried. I wanted it to be in Las Vegas next to her mother, who had died. Robin and Len Marmer wanted her buried in Los Angeles. Finally, Robin made the arrangements for the burial in the chapel. I talked to the kids, told them both what had happened. They were able to comprehend. I asked if they wanted to attend the funeral, and Steve said, "Please, I don't want to." Stephanie said, "We are not going." Look, I was fearful myself over a confrontation with Len Marmer. The speculation around was 50% that I had her killed, and the other 50% was that the mob had her killed. They're all wrong. I spent about $15,000 on an investigation. I got the detail. I believe she was overdosed. They killed her. They did it to her, the people around her. They knew she was a wealthy woman. She was getting $5,000 a month from me in alimony. She had all her jewels. But when police checked her apartment, everything was gone.
The story made the Los Angeles and Las Vegas papers, which reported that she had died of an apparent drug overdose and rehashed the recent events of her stormy marriage, her affair with Spilatro, and Lefty's car bombing. It was a story made for the tabloids and the cops. Frank Collada rejects the theory that Jerry was murdered because of her mob connections.
What probably happened was that some of her druggy biker friends got the idea that Jerry would inherit a fortune from the insurance if she suddenly became a widow. So first they tried to blow up Lefty, and when they missed, they knew they were in trouble, especially if Jerry pieced their move together. That's why they killed her, just 4 weeks after Lefty's car explosion. What a coincidence. And what was she doing, wandering around that miserable area on Hollywood at 4:30 in the morning? She wasn't. She was in the car with her killers, her pals, the guys who tried to blow up Lefty, who were now pumping her full of pills and booze. All they had to do was stop the car, let her out on the street, and drive off.
Barbara McGee Stokich has a similar theory. She believes that someone murdered her sister, gave her an injection of something. In January of 1983, the L.A. County coroner said the death was accidental, an apparent lethal combination of cocaine, Valium, and Jack Daniel's whiskey. It was very close to the end for everyone. Lefty's explosion and Jerry's death were followed by indictments, convictions, and more death. The hundreds of Justice Department wiretaps resulted in the indictments and eventual conviction of the major mob bosses who were involved in skimming the Stardust and Tropicana hotels. The second phase of the Argent case, which charged some of the same defendants with diverting nearly $2 million in Argent money to the skim, needed a good witness. The government gave Alan Glick immunity, and he took the stand. Glick testified for 4 days, laying out in great detail how he had encountered Frank Balistrieri and how he had gotten his loan. Glick was a devastating witness. He was precise and incapable of being ruffled. He projected total honesty. When the guilty verdicts were handed down, it was no surprise, and neither were the stiff sentences. Joe Iupa, the 77-year-old Chicago boss, and his 71-year-old underboss, Jackie Cerrone, got 28 years each. The 73-year-old Mace Rockman got 24 years. Carl DeLuna and Carl Savella each received 16 years to run concurrently with a previous sentence. John and Joseph Balistrieri were acquitted of all charges. 1983 was a turning point in the history of Las Vegas. The Tropicana and Argent cases were wending their way through pretrial hearings and on to trials and eventually to convictions. The last Teamster Pension Fund loan was paid off. The mob's main muscle as far as controlling the financing of casinos was gone. In 1983, the Nevada Gaming Commission suspended the Stardust's license because of yet another skim investigation and installed one of their own Gaming Control Board supervisors in Lefty's old office to run the Stardust. State officials were able to fire or force into early retirement many of the employees who had been part of the various skims that had been going on for years. And in 1983, Lefty Rosenthal and his family moved to California. For most of that year, Lefty's life revolved around the extraordinary feats his children performed as competitive swimmers. If Mike Kintz hadn't been seated high in his tractor, he would never have noticed the bare patch of earth. Kintz had leased a 5-acre cornfield in Enos, Indiana, about 60 miles southeast of Chicago. The corn was about 4 inches high and in a couple of weeks would have grown tall enough to cover the field and obscure the marks on the ground that made it look as though something had been dragged about 100 feet from the road to the bare patch. Kintz suspected that a poacher had probably buried the remains of a deer carcass in the cornfield after removing the edible meat. It had happened before. So he called Dave Hudson, the wildlife preserve's biologist and game warden. It took Hudson about 20 minutes of digging in the soft, sandy earth before he struck something firm. He looked into the 3-foot-deep hole and saw a patch of white skin. 2 bodies had been dumped on top of each other in a 5-foot grave. They were naked, except for their undershorts. Their faces were so badly disfigured that it was not until the FBI lab had a chance to run through the fingerprints 4 days later that the men were identified as Anthony Spilatro, 48, and his brother Michael, 41. The 2 had been reported missing 9 days earlier by Michael's wife, Anne, and there was some speculation at the time that the Spilatros, both of whom were facing trials within a matter of weeks, had purposely disappeared. Spilatro was going to be a busy man. He was facing the Stardust Skim trial. He was about to be retried in the hole-in-the-wall conspiracy case. The first trial had ended in mistrial because of a bribe attempt made to one of the jurors. He was also scheduled to be tried for violating the civil rights of a government witness he was suspected of having murdered. His brother Michael was awaiting trial in Chicago on an extortion sting investigation that showed organized crime links to sex clubs and prostitutes in Chicago's western suburbs. The grave was about 4 miles from a farm owned by Joseph J. Ayupa, Chicago's ex-mob boss, who was at the time in prison on charges that he had skimmed Las Vegas casinos. Today in Las Vegas, the men in fedoras who built the city are gone. The gamblers with no last names and suitcases filled with cash are reluctant to show up in the new Las Vegas for fear of being turned into the IRS by a 25-year-old hotel school graduate working casino credit on weekends. Las Vegas has become an adult theme park, a place where parents can take their kids and have a little fun themselves. While the kids play cardboard pirate at the Treasure Island Casino or joust with knights at the Excalibur, Mommy and Daddy can drop the mortgage money and Junior's college tuition on the poker slots. The Teamsters Pension Fund has been replaced by junk bonds as the primary source of casino funding, but while junk bond interest rates are high, they're not as high as what the outfit charged. Casino executives who borrow the money don't have to meet their stockbrokers in darkened Kansas City hotel rooms at 3 o'clock in the morning and be told they're going to get their eyes plucked out. Tony and Jerry are dead, and Lefty is gone. Lefty now lives in a house on a golf course in a walled community in Boca Raton. He plays a little, watches his investments, and helps his nephew run a nightclub. Sometimes he sits in a small elevated area in the nightclub and aims a penlight at waiters he believes are not clearing tables fast enough. For years, Lefty nursed a hope that he would be allowed to return to Las Vegas. But in 1987 he was placed in the Black Book and was forbidden to set foot in a casino ever again. Years of fighting the decision amounted to nothing. Frank Collada summed up the situation.
It should have been so sweet. Everything was in place. We were given paradise on earth, but we fucked it all up.
It would be the last time street guys were ever given anything that valuable again.